Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. Cursed waters. I've always found a strange kind of peace near water, even when it was far from calm. Lakes, rivers, oceans, there was something about their vastness, their stillness, that made me feel small, insignificant, and yet at the same time, oddly safe. That was until I came to Michigan. The place was quiet, almost too quiet, like it was holding its breath. It was a small town, nestled along the edge of a lake that looked so inviting at first glance, shimmering, vast, untouched. Yet, beneath that calm surface, something felt wrong. The locals didn't speak much about the lake. There were rumors, whispers in the bars, nervous glances when the topic was brought up, stories told in hushed voices, as if the very mention could summon whatever had been lurking there for years. They called it the Hollow. I didn't understand. I had come to Michigan to escape, to clear my head, to get away from the mess I had made of my life. I rented a small cabin on the edge of the water, just far enough to see the whole lake, but close enough to feel its pull. The first night, the air was thick with humidity, clinging to my skin, making it hard to breathe. I remember hearing the waves lapping against the shore, the sound soft and distant, almost soothing. But there was something else. Something beneath it. A strange whisper in the air, like a low murmur coming from the water itself. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, the trees swaying, the distant hum of the town. But it felt too deliberate. Too intent. I decided to ignore it. I had my own problems to deal with. The next morning, I went down to the shore. The water was smooth, almost glass-like. The surface was perfect, too perfect, like a mirror that reflected the sky without flaw. There was no movement, no ripples, no sign of life. It made me uneasy in a way I couldn't explain. As I stood there, staring at the stillness, a soft sound reached my ears. A gentle splash. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there, no birds, no fish, nothing to cause the disturbance. I convinced myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting, hidden beneath the surface. Later that evening, as I sat on the porch, sipping my drink and trying to push aside the unease that had been growing inside me, I noticed something strange. A small boat, just a speck on the horizon, moving slowly across the water. It was strange, no one ever went out on the lake this late. I hadn't seen anyone all day, except for the occasional car driving past. Yet there it was, moving steadily toward the middle of the lake. I watched it for a while, the tiny figure silhouetted against the darkening sky, until it seemed to stop. I blinked, and when my eyes refocused, the boat was gone. No splash. No sign of movement. I convinced myself it was just a trick of the fading light, a figment of my imagination. But that nagging sense of something wrong wouldn't leave. That night, sleep was fitful. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the water in my dreams, thick and black, reaching out, swallowing everything in its path. I would wake up gasping for air, convinced that something was waiting for me outside. But when I looked out the window, the lake remained calm, its surface like a mirror, reflecting only the dark sky. I tried to tell myself I was overreacting, but I couldn't escape the feeling that something was wrong with that lake. And the longer I stayed, the more I felt it calling to me. I wasn't sure how much longer I could ignore it. The following days blurred together, each one indistinguishable from the last. I tried to focus on the tasks at hand, fixing up the cabin, making the place feel more like home, but the lake was always there, looming in the distance, its silence a constant reminder of something watching. I couldn't shake the feeling that the water had its own agenda, that it was waiting for something. It had always seemed like a peaceful place to escape, but now it felt suffocating, as if the lake was pressing in on me, slowly, methodically. The eerie stillness was no longer soothing, it was unsettling, like an unreadable expression on a stranger's face. I tried to go for a walk, to clear my mind, but the forest surrounding the cabin felt unnaturally dense, the trees looming like dark sentinels. They blocked out the sun in places, casting everything in a cold, dim light that made everything seem off. As I walked along the shore, I noticed the remnants of an old pier jutting out into the water. It looked ancient, decayed and broken, like it hadn't been touched in years. A strange compulsion tugged at me, urging me closer. Something in the air shifted as I approached the end of the pier. The water seemed to respond to my presence, ripples forming where none should be. It was as if the lake recognized me, like it was acknowledging my arrival. My heart raced, but I took another step, until I was standing at the very edge. The view was breathtaking, a perfect stretch of water, the sun setting low behind the trees, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch forever. But as I looked closer, I noticed something else, a figure, barely discernible, standing in the water. It was far enough out that it was impossible to make out clearly, but it was unmistakable. A human form, standing perfectly still, as if it were waiting for something. My breath caught in my throat. My first instinct was to call out, but the words caught in my mouth, swallowed by the oppressive silence that hung thick in the air. I watched, my eyes locked on the figure, but it didn't move. It didn't even seem to breathe. I stood there, frozen, unable to look away, but eventually, the sun dipped below the horizon, and the figure vanished. I blinked hard, trying to convince myself that it had been a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the fading day. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The figure had been real. And worse still, it had felt like it had been waiting for me. The fear that had been growing inside me began to take root. I felt like I was being pulled towards something I couldn't explain, couldn't understand. The lake wasn't just a body of water. It was alive in a way I couldn't fathom, and it wanted me to know it. That night, sleep didn't come easy. My mind raced, replaying everything, the figure, the way the water had moved as though responding to my presence, the eerie stillness that had settled over everything. And then, in the dead of night, as I lay in the dark, a sound shattered the silence. A soft, almost imperceptible splash, followed by another. I shot up in bed, heart pounding. I knew it wasn't the wind or an animal. This sound was deliberate, rhythmic, like something or someone was moving just below the surface of the water, right outside the cabin. I grabbed a flashlight and hurried to the window. The lake was still, just as it had been when I went to bed. But the sound kept coming. Soft splashes. Closer now. I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin as I realized the noise was coming from directly in front of me. I opened the door slowly, stepping out into the night air. The sound stopped as soon as I crossed the threshold. The lake was eerily quiet. The only sound now was the soft rustling of the trees. I scanned the water, but there was nothing except the calm, glassy surface reflecting the pale moonlight. I could feel my breath coming in shallow gasps, my mind racing for an explanation. I told myself it was just an animal, some kind of fish or bird making its way across the shore. But deep down, I knew better. Whatever was making those sounds wasn't natural. It wasn't of this world. I stepped back inside, locking the door behind me. The fear had a new edge now. It wasn't just the lake anymore. It was the thing that moved beneath it, the thing that waited for something or someone to come too close. And I was getting closer. I didn't know how, but I could feel it. The lake was drawing me in, its pull growing stronger with each passing hour. I couldn't leave. I couldn't escape. Not until I knew what it wanted. The dread beneath the surface had only just begun to show itself. The next day, the lake seemed to mock me. The morning sun shimmered across its surface like nothing had happened the night before. No sounds. No figures. Just a vast, serene expanse of water that had no hint of the terror it concealed beneath. But I couldn't pretend anymore. The unease gnawed at me constantly, like an itch I couldn't scratch. I decided to venture into town. I needed answers, something to help me make sense of this madness. The town was small, with little more than a handful of houses, a few shops, and a diner that smelled of stale coffee and fried food. The people were friendly, but distant. It was clear they didn't want to talk about the lake. I found that out the hard way. I sat at the counter in the diner, nursing a cup of coffee, trying to catch the eye of the waitress. She was older, maybe in her late 50s, with gray hair pulled back into a tight bun. When she finally looked at me, her eyes were wary, almost sad. "You new around here?" she asked, her voice cautious. I nodded. "Just moved in by the lake." Her expression hardened, her lips pressing into a thin line. "You don't want to be near that lake, honey. People around here have learned to stay away." I tried to keep my voice casual, but the question slipped out before I could stop it. "Why? What's wrong with it?" She hesitated, her eyes darting to the door like she was checking to make sure no one was listening. "It's not just the lake," she said, leaning closer. "It's the water. People go out there, and they don't come back. Sometimes they do, but they're not the same. Something's wrong with it, something deep down. You don't want to know." I pressed for more, asking about the disappearances, about the strange occurrences. She shook her head and stood up quickly, backing away from the counter. "I've said enough. If you're smart, you leave that place behind. You'll be safer if you just forget about it." Her warning hung in the air as I watched her walk away, a tight knot forming in my chest. I didn't know what to make of it. She was afraid. Afraid of something she wouldn't even say out loud. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I returned to the cabin, feeling the weight of the town's silence pressing down on me. The sun was setting when I got back, casting long, distorted shadows over the lake. The strange feeling in my gut only deepened as I approached the water. I couldn't stay away anymore. I needed to know. I couldn't leave without understanding what had been happening here, what had been happening to me. I grabbed a kayak from the shed behind the cabin and set out, paddling slowly toward the middle of the lake. The water felt colder than I remembered, seeping into my skin with each stroke. As I ventured farther out, the sounds of the shore faded, replaced by the soft lapping of water against the hull. And then, just like that, it happened. The air shifted, became heavy, thick with something I couldn't name. The water around me stilled, and I felt a strange sensation, as if the lake had noticed me, as if it was aware of my presence. I froze, gripping the paddle tightly. I could hear my breath, ragged and shallow in the otherwise oppressive silence. And then something moved. A shadow stretching beneath the water's surface. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, some fish or a ripple, but the shape beneath the surface grew, stretching and shifting like it was alive. I felt my heart race in my chest, my breath quickening. I paddled faster, but the shadow followed, moving beneath me in eerie synchronization. It was as though the lake had become alive, responding to my fear, feeding off it. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, grew overwhelming. I stopped paddling, my hands frozen to the oars. The shadow beneath me lingered, moving ever so slightly, but never leaving. And then came the whispers, soft, like a voice carried on the wind. "Come closer." I jerked my head around, expecting to see someone, but there was no one. The voice wasn't human. It wasn't even animal. It was cold, distant, as if it came from far beneath the water. I looked down, and the shadow stretched up toward me, the water now swirling in slow, deliberate circles. I had to get out of there. My body moved on instinct. I paddled as fast as I could, my eyes wide with terror, but the shadow was relentless. It followed me, undeterred, keeping pace with my frantic movements. The water churned beneath me, a sound that grew louder, more chaotic. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the lake went still again. No ripples. No shadow. I stopped, my breath coming in gasps. I glanced around, nothing. No sign of the presence I'd felt so intensely moments before. But I wasn't alone. I turned back toward the shore, my gaze landing on the figure standing at the edge of the water. A man, tall and gaunt, his clothes soaked, his face hollow and blank. He didn't move, didn't acknowledge me. But the sense of dread that radiated from him was palpable. For the first time, I felt the true weight of the lake's curse. It wasn't just the water. It was the people, those who had come before me, those who had crossed paths with whatever haunted these waters. I had to get away. But I knew, deep down, there was no escaping it now. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The image of that figure, standing motionless by the water's edge, haunted me. His eyes, though empty, seemed to bore into my mind, his silent presence echoing with a coldness that felt like it was stretching out from the very heart of the lake itself. I stayed inside the cabin, locking every door, checking every window, but I knew it was pointless. The lake's pull was inescapable. The shadows under the water, the whispers, everything was beginning to bleed together, turning the air thick with an oppressive dread. I could feel it creeping through the walls, seeping into my bones, making me question whether I had truly seen what I thought I had. Was it just the isolation, the stress? Had my mind started to break under the weight of it all? I tried to reason with myself, to find some logical explanation. But there was none. The sounds, the shadows, none of it could be explained away. Every rational thought I tried to cling to felt more fragile, like it was unraveling, slipping away into the depths. The next day, I tried to keep myself busy. I went into town again, hoping to find some sort of distraction, some way to take my mind off the lake and its horrors. But when I arrived, the town felt even quieter than before. The streets were empty. The shops closed. No one was around. It was as if the place had been abandoned overnight. I walked through the town, my footsteps echoing against the empty streets, until I found myself standing in front of the diner. The door was locked, the lights off. But as I turned to leave, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the street, an old man, his face hidden by the shadows of his wide-brimmed hat. He was staring at me, his gaze intense, almost knowing. My heart skipped a beat. "Are you here for the lake?" he asked in a voice that cracked like dry wood. I froze, unable to speak. How could he know? He took a slow step forward, his eyes never leaving mine. "It calls to you, doesn't it?" His voice was low, almost a whisper. "You can feel it, can't you? It's been pulling you in from the moment you set foot here." I nodded, my throat tight with fear. "There's no escaping it," he continued, his words heavy with a strange kind of sorrow. "No matter how far you run, it will follow. It will always follow. It's not just the lake. It's what lives within it. And it wants you. All of you." The fear that had been simmering inside me reached its boiling point. "What do you mean? What is it? What's happening to this place?" My voice trembled, barely above a whisper. The old man looked around, as if checking to see if anyone else was listening. Then, he leaned in closer. "It's the water. It's alive, in a way. It feeds on fear, on loss. It takes people. It takes their souls, and it twists them. Makes them something else. But you have to understand, no one is safe. No one who comes here can leave unchanged." I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. "So, it's not just the lake. It's everything," he interrupted. "The land, the water, the people. They're all part of it. You'll see." I wanted to run, to flee. But something kept me there, rooted to the spot, the old man's words echoing in my mind. Suddenly, I felt the ground tremble beneath my feet. The old man didn't flinch. He just watched me, his expression unreadable. I turned toward the source of the disturbance. The town seemed to shift, the buildings bending slightly, as if the earth itself was twisting. Then, the sound came, a low, rumbling growl from the direction of the lake. It was more than just noise. It was a force, something powerful, something that shook the very air around me. The old man took a slow step backward, his eyes narrowing as though expecting something. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran, my breath ragged, my legs burning as I sprinted toward the cabin. The growl grew louder, vibrating in my chest. I could feel the lake calling me, its dark voice rising above the town, above the very earth itself. When I reached the cabin, I slammed the door behind me and bolted it shut, my hands trembling. I couldn't make sense of anything anymore. The lake was alive. The town was dying. The people, they weren't people anymore. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath, trying to make sense of everything. But the whispers didn't stop. They filled my mind, growing louder, clearer. "Come closer. Come into the water." I looked out the window, my eyes wide with terror. The water was still. But it was no longer calm. It was alive, pulsing with an unnatural rhythm. And there, at the edge of the lake, the figure stood again. The man from before, staring at me, unmoving. His eyes seemed deeper now, darker, as though the lake itself had taken him and made him part of it. "You can't run." I didn't know how much longer I could hold on. The lake was calling, and it was getting stronger. It wasn't just a curse anymore. It was a living, breathing thing. And it was coming for me. I had to face it. I had to know what it wanted. But I could feel it, deep inside. There was no way out. The night was suffocating, the darkness pressing in from all sides. I could feel it now, the lake pulling at me, its presence like a weight in my chest, a constant, crushing pressure that threatened to swallow me whole. The whispers had become a constant hum in my mind, a low murmur that never ceased. They were everywhere, not just from the water anymore, but inside my head, wrapping themselves around my thoughts until I could no longer tell where I ended and they began. Come closer. I could hear it clearer now. It wasn't a voice, it was something deeper, more primal, a compulsion that thrummed beneath my skin, urging me to step outside, to walk down to the water, to give in. I couldn't resist it anymore. The lake had already claimed so much of me. What difference would it make? I stood up from the floor, my body moving without thought, my legs taking me toward the door. My hands were shaking, but I didn't stop. The pull was too strong now. I couldn't fight it. Outside, the air felt wrong, thick with the same heavy, oppressive energy that had consumed everything since I arrived. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale light over the landscape. The trees were like dark sentinels, their twisted shapes barely visible in the gloom. The cabin seemed miles away, a distant memory, as I walked toward the water. As I approached the shore, the lake seemed to react to my presence, the water rippling and shifting as if something beneath was stirring. The figure from before was there, standing at the edge of the water, his face hidden in shadow. But now, I could see his eyes. They were dark, bottomless pits that seemed to reach into the very core of my being. "You're too late," he whispered, his voice a rasping, hollow sound that seemed to reverberate through the air. "It's already begun." I stopped. The fear that had been building inside me, that I had tried to suppress for so long, surged to the surface. I wanted to run, to turn and flee, but I couldn't. The lake had already claimed me, and now it was drawing me in. I could feel it in my bones, in the cold, unnatural air that wrapped around me like a vice. The water began to churn violently, a vortex forming in the center of the lake. The shadows beneath the surface twisted and writhed, shapes moving in ways that didn't belong to nature. The sound of splashing grew louder, more urgent, and I realized, with a sickening clarity, that the lake was alive. It was feeding, and I was the prey. The figure stepped forward, his face now illuminated by the pale moonlight. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes, those deep, hollow eyes, seemed to reflect the black depths of the water. He reached out a hand toward me, his fingers long and skeletal. "Come," he whispered, and his voice wasn't his own anymore. It was the lake's voice, the voice of something ancient, something that had always been here, waiting. I couldn't move. My body was paralyzed, my mind screaming for me to fight, to resist, but the pull was too strong. The whispers, the compulsion, the fear, they all wrapped around me, suffocating me, drowning me in the weight of their presence. I took a step forward, then another. The water seemed to rise to meet me, the surface shifting like it was alive, as if it were calling me by name. My feet touched the cold, slimy water, and I felt a jolt of ice shoot through my body, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The figure was now standing right in front of me, his cold, dead eyes staring into mine. His hand reached out, brushing my cheek with fingers that felt like ice. "You're one of us now," he whispered. "You belong to the lake." I wanted to scream, to pull away, but the words caught in my throat. It was too late. The darkness had already claimed me. The lake roared around me, the water rising, pulling me down into its depths. I tried to fight, but the pressure was too much, the weight of it suffocating me. The cold enveloped me, swallowed me whole, dragging me deeper into the abyss. And then, everything went black. When I awoke, I was no longer on the shore. The water was around me, but it wasn't cold anymore. It was warm, almost comforting, like a heavy blanket. The sounds of the lake were muffled, distant. I tried to move, but my limbs felt heavy, unresponsive. My mind was foggy, as if I were waking from a long, deep sleep. And then I heard it. The whispers. They were clearer now, closer. They didn't come from the water, they came from within me. My body was no longer my own. The voices were inside, their presence overwhelming, their demands clear. Join us. I looked down at my hands. They were pale, translucent, just like the figures. My skin was slick, almost like it was made of water. My body was changing, becoming something else, something part of the lake. I wasn't just a victim. I had become a part of it. And as I sank deeper into the water, I understood the truth. The lake had always been alive. And now, I was part of it. A part of its endless, dark hunger. There was no escape. There never had been. The lake didn't just claim bodies, it claimed souls. And now, my soul belonged to it, forever lost in its dark, suffocating depths. The whispers became louder, more insistent. Welcome home. And I understood. I was never meant to leave. I was never meant to be anything but this, another voice in the endless chorus of the lake, another soul swallowed by its dark, insatiable hunger. The shadow behind the door. I arrived in New Jersey late in the evening, tired from the long drive and ready to check into the hotel for some rest. It had been a chaotic week, filled with work deadlines and endless meetings. A quiet night in a small town was exactly what I needed. The hotel was older than I expected, its faded sign and creaking floors adding to the sense of antiquity. But it was charming in its own way, and I was too exhausted to care much about the details. The receptionist was an older woman, her gray hair neatly pulled back. She gave me a polite smile and handed me the key. Room 306. Have a good night, she said, her voice warm, but something about the way she said it seemed off. I nodded, taking the key, not thinking much of it. The hallway leading to my room was narrow, dimly lit, with wallpaper peeling at the edges. The smell of stale air lingered, but I shrugged it off. It was a small, old hotel. I'd been in worse. When I reached room 306, the door creaked as I pushed it open. The room was small but clean enough, a simple bed, a worn-out chair, and a small desk. I threw my bag on the bed, went to the bathroom to wash my face, and then pulled the curtains open to look out at the darkened street below. The view wasn't much, just a few quiet buildings and empty sidewalks, but it felt peaceful. I turned off the lights, crawled into bed, and closed my eyes, eager to get some sleep. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, and for a few minutes, I thought I might actually be able to relax for the first time in days. But then I heard it. A faint scraping noise. It was so quiet that I thought I imagined it at first. But as I listened, it came again, a soft, deliberate scrape, like something moving slowly along the floor just outside my door. I sat up, my heart beating a little faster. What was that? I stared at the door, straining my ears. The noise continued, growing louder now, slow, rhythmic, like someone was dragging something heavy. I thought about getting up to check, but something stopped me. Maybe it was just the building settling, the sounds of an old hotel. Or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me after the long drive. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, just the wind or an old pipe groaning. But the scraping persisted, and it wasn't stopping. The sound grew closer until it was right outside my door. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. It was as though whatever was outside the door was waiting, just standing there. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, unlocking it with shaky hands. I glanced at the time, 2:30 in the morning. I couldn't help but feel a wave of dread wash over me. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it wasn't normal. There was something wrong. I got out of bed, slowly walking toward the door, my mind racing with possible explanations. Could someone be playing a prank? Was there a maintenance worker outside? But the idea of someone just standing there, making that sound, it didn't make sense. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, just staring at the door. And then, suddenly, the scraping stopped. I waited, my pulse thundering in my ears. Nothing. Absolute silence. Was it over? I turned the handle, slowly, and opened the door a crack. The hallway was empty. No one was there. The lights above flickered slightly, casting strange shadows along the walls. I looked left, then right, and saw nothing but the stillness of the hallway stretching out before me. I stepped out into the corridor, my heart still racing, but there was no sign of anything unusual. No one around. No sounds. Nothing. I closed the door and locked it again, my mind struggling to make sense of it all. Maybe it was just the stress. Maybe I had imagined it. But that scraping noise, it had been too real. I climbed back into bed, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. But sleep wouldn't come. I lay there for hours, wide awake, every creak of the building, every shift of the wind outside, making me jump. Finally, just before dawn, exhaustion overcame me, and I drifted into a restless sleep, filled with strange dreams of dark shadows lurking just beyond my door. But when I woke up the next morning, something felt different. Something was wrong. The room looked the same, but it felt off. As if the air had changed overnight, thick with a presence I couldn't explain. I stood in front of the mirror, trying to calm myself. It had probably been a combination of stress and sleep deprivation. I had to stop letting my mind play tricks on me. But then I noticed something strange. In the reflection behind me, just by the door, there was a shadow, a figure. It was barely there, just a faint shape, like someone standing in the hallway. I spun around, heart racing. But again, nothing. The hallway was empty. The door was closed. I turned back to the mirror. The shadow was gone. I shook my head, taking a deep breath. It was nothing. I was just tired. But as I grabbed my things and left the room to check out, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me all night, waiting. The shadow was still there, lingering behind my eyes, following me even as I walked out into the daylight. I couldn't escape the feeling that I wasn't alone. The hotel lobby was quiet when I arrived downstairs. The receptionist, the same woman who had checked me in the previous night, was sitting at the desk, flipping through a newspaper. She barely looked up when I approached, offering me a polite nod. "Checking out?" she asked, her voice as calm and flat as before. I nodded, trying to ignore the lingering discomfort I still felt. I handed her the key, attempting to act as normal as possible, but inside, my mind was still racing with the events of the night. "Everything all right with your room?" she asked, her gaze briefly flicking to the hallway behind me. I hesitated for a moment, wondering whether I should tell her about the strange noises, the shadow in the mirror. It was probably just me being paranoid, right? I didn't want to sound like I was overreacting, or worse, crazy. Yeah, everything was fine, I said, forcing a smile. She nodded, seemingly satisfied, and gave me a receipt. Have a safe trip. I didn't stay to chat any longer. I grabbed my bag and left the hotel, trying to shake the unease that had followed me since the night before. The sun was up, and the streets of New Jersey seemed more normal in the daylight. People were going about their business, cars passed by, and everything felt ordinary, at least on the surface. But as I walked to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me from that room. Something had watched me all night, and now it was with me, lurking in the corners of my mind. I dismissed it. I was just tired. Maybe I needed a better night's sleep, one without the sounds of an old hotel settling. I tried to distract myself, putting on music in the car and focusing on the road ahead. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself that it had all been in my head, the unease didn't fade. If anything, it only seemed to grow stronger. The next night, I stayed at a different hotel, a modern one with clean, bright hallways and freshly painted walls. It was a welcome change after the old, creaky building I had left behind. But as I unpacked my things and settled into the new room, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't the same as before, it wasn't the scraping sounds or the strange shadows, but something in the air felt wrong. The night passed uneventfully, but I couldn't sleep. My eyes darted to the corners of the room, to the edges of the curtains, and I felt a strange pressure building in my chest, as if something invisible was hovering just outside the room, just out of reach. I tried to distract myself, watching TV, reading, but nothing worked. The feeling of being watched never left. It was around 2 in the morning when I finally heard it again. A soft, steady scraping. It was distant at first, as if from far down the hall. I sat up in bed, my heart suddenly racing. The sound, that unmistakable scrape, like something dragging across the floor, was back. I didn't get up this time. I stayed perfectly still, listening intently. The sound seemed to grow closer, just outside my door. The same rhythmic dragging, the same deliberate, slow movement. I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, my entire body tense, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Then, just like before, the sound stopped. Silence. I was too terrified to check, but I knew I had to. My breath came in shallow bursts, my palms sweating as I reached for the door handle. Slowly, I opened the door, my eyes scanning the dark hallway. It was empty. No one was there. The hallway looked completely normal, as if nothing had happened at all. But the sensation of something lurking, something unseen, was more intense than ever. The air felt thick, as if it were closing in on me. I closed the door quickly, locking it behind me, my heart still pounding in my chest. It didn't make sense. No one could have been out there. I would have heard footsteps. But the sound had been unmistakable. I lay back down, my mind racing, but sleep never came. I lay there in the dark, eyes wide open, listening for any sign of movement. I couldn't escape the feeling that something was in the room with me. Watching. Waiting. The next morning, I tried to brush it off. Another restless night. Maybe it was just my imagination. But the unease didn't go away. It had been growing, like an unshakable weight pressing down on me. And as I checked out of the hotel that morning, I noticed something strange. The receptionist, a young man this time, gave me a strange look as I approached the desk. "Is everything okay with your stay?" he asked, his tone a little too polite. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should tell him about the noises. But I didn't. There was something in the way he looked at me, something that made me feel like I shouldn't say anything at all. "Yeah," I said again, my voice unsteady. Everything was fine. He nodded but said nothing else. As I walked out of the hotel, I felt it again. That presence. That feeling of being watched, of being followed. I glanced over my shoulder, but the streets were empty. The world was moving on, but I was stuck, trapped in unease that seemed to haunt me wherever I went. I had no answers. I didn't know what was happening or why. But one thing was clear, I couldn't escape it. The shadow was following me, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to find out what it wanted, or if I could survive it. All I knew was that I couldn't outrun it forever. The days blurred together after that. I had left New Jersey behind, but the strange feeling that something was watching me never faded. The constant sense of unease, like I was being followed, hovered in my mind. I tried to focus on my work, but it was impossible to shake the thought of what had happened. Every night, I would lie awake, listening to the smallest sounds in my room, convinced that something was just beyond my sight. I decided to drive out of the city, hoping that getting away from everything would help clear my mind. I found a small, quiet town to stay in, a place far away from the busy streets and crowded hotels. The kind of place where nothing ever happens, where you could spend the night and not worry about anything at all. At least, that's what I told myself. I checked into a small bed and breakfast. It was cozy, charming in its own rustic way, and the owner, an elderly man with a gentle smile, welcomed me with a cup of tea. "You're our only guest tonight," he said, as though the place had been waiting for me. I thanked him and headed up to my room. The bed was old-fashioned, the kind with a carved wooden frame and a quilted blanket. It looked comfortable, even though the wooden floors creaked under every step I took. I tried to relax. I unpacked my things, took a long shower, and sat down in a small armchair by the window. Outside, the town was quiet, peaceful even. It should have been perfect. But inside, I felt that familiar tension, the feeling that something wasn't right. The shadows in the room seemed darker than they should have been, and even the air felt thick, like I couldn't breathe properly. I dismissed it as just the weight of everything I had been through. But then, it happened again. The scraping. I froze, my eyes darting toward the door. The same faint noise, slow and deliberate, like something dragging along the floor. It wasn't as loud as it had been before, but it was unmistakable. I stared at the door, listening. It was so quiet now, the only sound that scraping, getting closer with every second. My heart began to race. I had to get up and check, right? But a part of me was terrified. What if something was out there? What if it wasn't just a sound, but something worse? I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. I stood up, my legs shaking slightly as I approached the door. My mind screamed at me to stop, but I couldn't just ignore it. The noise was there. I could hear it moving, dragging along the floor just outside. I opened the door slowly, my breath held in my chest. The hallway was empty. But something was wrong. The hallway, which had been perfectly ordinary moments ago, now looked different. The shadows were deeper, darker, as though the light had shifted. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw something, a figure, just out of the corner of my eye. I spun around, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty. I stepped out cautiously, my heart thudding in my chest. The sound had stopped, but the tension in the air remained. It felt like I was walking through a dream, where nothing made sense and everything was just slightly off. I walked down the hallway, past the other rooms. Everything seemed normal, but there was something unsettling about it. The silence felt unnatural, as though the building was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. When I turned to head back to my room, something caught my eye. A mirror hanging on the wall near the end of the hallway. The reflection was faint, but something in it made me stop. The mirror wasn't showing the hallway behind me, no, it was showing the room I had just come from. But it was different. The reflection in the mirror was slightly distorted, as though it had been warped by some unseen force. The door to my room was open in the reflection, but there was something inside, something that shouldn't have been there. A figure. A shadowy figure, standing perfectly still by the window, just like I had been earlier. I blinked, and the figure was gone. But the reflection still seemed wrong. The shadows in the mirror were too deep, the angle too strange. The room and the reflection didn't match what I saw in reality. It was as if the mirror was showing something else, something that wasn't supposed to be there. I stepped back, feeling a cold shiver crawl up my spine. My mind raced. Could it have been a trick of the light? Was I just imagining things? But it didn't feel like that. It felt real. And worse, it felt like the mirror was trying to tell me something. I quickly turned away, hurrying back to my room. I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it with trembling hands. My head spun, my heart racing. I had to get out of there. I couldn't stay here any longer. The feeling of being watched was stronger than ever, and the idea that something, some force, was trying to make contact with me from beyond the mirror terrified me. I tried to calm myself, tried to reason it away. It was just a reflection, a trick of my mind. I was exhausted, stressed, and I had to stop overthinking everything. But then I saw it. In the reflection of the window, just behind me, a shadow was moving. Slowly, deliberately. It wasn't my own. I spun around, but the room was empty. Nothing was there. I checked the door, double-checked the lock, but I could feel it, the presence, the thing that had been following me. It was inside the room now. And it wasn't going away. I sank to my knees, my mind spiraling out of control. There was no escape. I couldn't breathe. The air around me seemed thick, suffocating, as if the room itself was closing in on me. My hands trembled as I gripped the edge of the bed, trying to steady myself. The shadow, that shadow, had been there. I saw it, right in the reflection of the window. I glanced back at the mirror, hoping that the reflection would change, that what I was seeing was just a trick of my mind. But no! It was still there. The darkness in the corner of the room was deeper than the shadows should have been. The shape was solidifying, growing clearer with every second that passed. I stepped back from the mirror, my body cold with fear. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to run, but my feet felt like they were rooted to the floor. My mind, foggy and overwhelmed, kept trying to rationalize what was happening, but each time I tried to explain it away, the reality of the situation hit harder. This wasn't a dream. This wasn't my imagination. There was something in that room, and it wasn't meant to be there. A soft, low sound reached my ears, like something scraping against the floor again. But this time, it wasn't in the hallway. It was here, right in the room with me. The noise was coming from the closet. I froze. For a moment, there was nothing, just the sound of my own breath echoing in the silence. Then, there was another scrape. The same slow, deliberate movement. The closet door. It was slowly creaking open. I couldn't move. I couldn't even think straight. My heart thudded so loud in my chest that I thought it might burst. I watched as the door opened just a crack, and then nothing. Silence again. The scraping stopped. But I could still feel it, that weight in the air, pressing down on me. I couldn't stay here. I knew I couldn't. But my feet wouldn't move. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the door, from the space between the cracks, as if something would step out at any moment. I swallowed hard. It's just the wind, I whispered to myself, but I knew it wasn't true. Just the wind. Nothing else. But my words felt hollow in the room, as if the walls themselves were mocking me. The door creaked again, louder this time. The sound sent a jolt through my spine. I reached for the light switch, flicking it on, but the light didn't come on. The bulb buzzed, flickered, then died. I was in complete darkness. That's when I heard it. A voice. It was faint at first, a whisper just at the edge of my hearing, but it grew clearer with every passing second. The voice was soft, low, like a breath against my ear, but it wasn't my own. Leave now, before it's too late. I froze. The voice wasn't human. It wasn't even a whisper. It was something darker, something ancient. It felt wrong in the deepest way imaginable. And yet, I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, trapped in my own mind as the darkness closed in. The closet door suddenly slammed open. I didn't see it happen, but I felt it. The rush of air, the coldness, and then something moving toward me. I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, scraping across the floor. But when I looked, there was nothing there. My breath came in sharp gasps as I backed up, stumbling away from the spot where the footsteps were coming from. I tried to speak, to call for help, but no sound came from my mouth. I could feel my throat tighten, choking me with fear. It was like the world had gone silent, and I was the only one left in it. A prisoner in my own mind. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the sound stopped. I collapsed to the floor, tears streaming down my face. What was happening to me? What was following me? Why couldn't I escape it? I had to get out. I had to leave. I bolted for the door, but it was locked. I pulled at the handle, panic rising in my chest, but the door wouldn't budge. The cold, steady pressure on my back, the sense of something right behind me, was growing stronger. It was there. I knew it. I didn't need to turn around to know. I could feel it. The voice whispered again, louder this time, "You can't escape. You never will." And that was when I realized something. I hadn't just been hearing noises or seeing things. The shadows weren't just shadows. The thing that was after me, it was feeding on my fear. The more terrified I became, the stronger it got. And I was losing control of my mind, losing the ability to trust what was real, losing myself to something I couldn't even explain. The pressure behind me was unbearable now. I could feel its presence, cold and suffocating, pushing in from all sides. There was no escape. No way out. I turned around, my heart racing, and that's when I saw it. In the mirror. The reflection was no longer a warped image of the room. No, now it was different. The reflection showed me, standing in the middle of the room, but something was wrong. There was a figure behind me, tall, impossibly tall, with long, thin arms and a face that was both nothing and everything at once. Its eyes were black voids, empty and endless, staring right at me. It didn't move, but I knew it was waiting for me. The figure opened its mouth, and I heard the voice again, louder this time, "You're mine." And in that moment, I realized I had already lost. The shadow had claimed me. I had never really been able to escape. It wasn't just following me. It was me now. The room around me began to spin, my vision blurring as the darkness swallowed me whole. And then, there was only silence. I woke up gasping for air, my chest tight, my mind still reeling. But this wasn't the same room. This wasn't the bed and breakfast I had fled from. No, I was lying in a sterile, white room, surrounded by the hum of machines and the soft murmur of voices. My body felt heavy, like it didn't quite belong to me anymore. The world seemed distant, as if I were underwater, and I could barely hear the muffled sounds around me. I tried to sit up, but my limbs wouldn't respond. Panic surged through me. My throat felt raw, like I hadn't spoken in days. I couldn't remember how I had gotten here, or when I had arrived. All I knew was the horror, the thing that had followed me. It hadn't just been a nightmare. It had happened. I had seen it. Felt it. A voice spoke to me from the shadows of the room. It was calm, soothing even, but there was something in it that made my skin crawl. "You're safe now," the voice said. "The worst is over." But it wasn't over. I knew that deep down. The darkness hadn't let go. It couldn't. It had followed me here, wherever here was. I turned my head slowly, looking around the sterile room. There was no window, just the soft beeping of a heart monitor and the quiet murmur of nurses outside the door. But in the corner of the room, near the ceiling, was a shadow. A shape. It wasn't supposed to be there. There were no lights overhead, but somehow the shadow was darker than the surrounding darkness. It twisted and moved like smoke, curling around itself as if it were alive. I wanted to scream, to move, to escape, but I was paralyzed. My body didn't respond, and the more I tried to fight it, the more trapped I felt. The shadow grew larger, and suddenly, I was not just in the room anymore. I was in the hallway of that godforsaken hotel. The walls seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, and the same scraping sound filled the air. It was louder now, echoing through the empty space, coming closer with every beat of my heart. I looked down at myself, but I wasn't myself. I was the reflection, the figure in the mirror, the one that had waited for me. The thing behind me whispered again, its voice low, intimate, almost tender. "You thought you could escape, but you can't. You're already here, with me, where you belong." I tried to speak, but my lips were numb. I reached out, grasping for something, anything, but my hands passed right through the shadow. It was cold, like ice, and yet it burned me at the same time. A pain unlike any I had ever felt before. And then I saw it. In the reflection, a door. Just like the one from the hotel room. The one that led into the hallway. I could hear the scraping behind it again, faint at first, but growing louder. This wasn't real, I told myself. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be. I was in a hospital. I had to be. They had to have sedated me. But then, I saw the face. It appeared in the reflection, right beside me. The thing was grinning at me. Its smile stretched impossibly wide, jagged, like it didn't belong. It had no eyes, just dark pits of emptiness, staring into me, through me. The smile grew wider, as if it was savoring my terror, feeding on it. I reached out again, desperately trying to touch the reflection, to break through the glass, but my fingers brushed against nothing but cold air. "There's nowhere to run now," the thing whispered, its voice filling every corner of my mind. "You belong to me. You've always belonged to me." I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. My entire being felt like it was being pulled into that reflection, like the world was splitting in two. The shadow grew darker, deeper, and I could feel its presence expanding inside of me, wrapping itself around my mind, suffocating my thoughts. And then, in one final instant, I understood. It wasn't just following me. It was me. The fear, the isolation, the madness, it had all led to this. The shadow had been a part of me all along, waiting for the right moment to break free. I had been running from it, but it had been inside me the entire time. I was the reflection, and the reflection was me. The last thing I heard before the darkness took me completely was a whisper, a soft, deadly whisper. "You're mine now, forever." And then, there was nothing. Night rituals. The sun was setting over the Utah desert, casting long, eerie shadows across the cracked earth. I had been driving for hours, the lonely highway stretching endlessly before me, until I stumbled upon a small, secluded area, a place that wasn't even marked on the map. It seemed like the perfect spot to stretch my legs and get some rest before I continued my journey. But when I stepped out of the car, I felt it. The air was heavy, charged, as if something ancient was watching me. I shook off the feeling, telling myself it was just the isolation, the quiet. But something was wrong. Something I couldn't quite place. I made my way toward a small cluster of rocks in the distance, and that's when I saw them, footprints, unmistakable and clear. The ground was cracked and dry, but these prints were fresh, their outlines sharp against the desert floor. They led toward the ruins ahead, scattered remnants of what appeared to be an old temple or settlement. Strange symbols, half eroded by time, marked the walls like forgotten warnings. I knelt to inspect the prints, curiosity overtaking me. The shape was odd, large, claw-like feet, but not human. Maybe an animal. But no, something about the size and the way they seemed to disappear into the sand made no sense. They weren't from any creature I knew. My mind raced, searching for an explanation. The wind picked up, swirling dust around me, and for a moment, I thought I heard something. A low sound, like a chant. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, but I quickly dismissed it. There were no other cars around. No one else for miles. It had to be the wind. But then it came again, louder this time. The whispering. It was distant, but unmistakable. Something, or someone, was out there. I stood up and turned toward the ruins, my steps quickening, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The eerie sensation crawled up my spine, and I swallowed hard. I had come here to get away from it all, to clear my head, but the desert, this place, felt wrong. The ruins were older than anything I had ever seen. their stone walls crumbling but still imposing, standing against the test of time. They spoke of a civilization that had long vanished, but somehow I felt like the place was alive, holding on to something ancient, something powerful, something that had been waiting for someone to come along. I ventured deeper, my footsteps echoing in the hollow spaces of the ruins. My eyes scanned the walls, tracing the strange symbols. As I moved through the ruins, I felt a growing unease, like I was intruding on something sacred, something dangerous. And then I saw it. At the far end of the ruins, tucked away in a dark corner, was a stone altar. Covered in dust and age, but there was no mistaking what it was. A place for rituals. That's when I heard the noise again. This time it wasn't just a whisper. It was a voice. A low, guttural sound, like a chant or a prayer. I turned, but no one was there. The air felt thick now, heavy with the sense of being watched. I was no longer alone in the ruins. I didn't know what to do. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as the air seemed to grow colder, the chanting louder, reverberating in my chest. My mind raced, trying to explain it all away, trying to justify it, but the words in the air, the words I couldn't quite understand, were pulling me deeper into the ruins. And then, there was a movement in the shadows. A flicker, something large and dark, just beyond the corner of my vision. I turned sharply, my heart in my throat, but there was nothing there. I wasn't alone. I knew that now. The footsteps, the chanting, the shadows, it all pointed to something ancient and powerful. Something I wasn't meant to understand. And as the last rays of sunlight vanished behind the horizon, I realized that I had stumbled into something far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. The desert had always felt like a place of emptiness, a place where time seemed to stretch endlessly, untouched by civilization. But tonight, the emptiness was different. It felt oppressive. The weight of the silence pressed down on me, making each breath feel shallow, each step heavier. The wind had died, and the only sound left was the faint echo of my own heartbeat. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the dark corner of the ruins where I'd seen that shadow move. It was like something was waiting for me, lurking just beyond the light, where the deep shadows clung to the walls like hungry fingers. The wind had stopped completely. Everything was still. Too still. I took a hesitant step forward, my boots crunching against the dust beneath me. The faint chanting from earlier had become more distinct, but still unintelligible. My heart raced, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. What was it? Was it just my mind playing tricks on me? Or was there something here, something ancient and forgotten that I was never meant to find? I glanced back toward the entrance of the ruins. My car was parked where I had left it, but the thought of returning there, of breaking free from the grip of the place, felt impossible. The ground beneath my feet seemed to pulse, as if the very earth was alive, beckoning me deeper into the ruins. The shadow at the edge of my vision had disappeared, but I felt its presence lingering, watching. I took another step. And then another. The further I ventured, the stronger the pull became. It wasn't just the ruins that had their hold on me, it was something in the air, something in the very stones. As I approached the stone altar at the far end, I noticed something in the dim light. A pattern etched into the stone. A symbol, like an eye, surrounded by lines that seemed to writhe and shift while I looked at them too long. I reached out to touch it, my fingers trembling, and the moment they made contact, the temperature around me dropped, sending a shiver through my body. The ground beneath me vibrated slightly, like a faint hum coming from deep below. The chanting grew louder, more distinct, and I could almost make out the words, though they were foreign, ancient, impossible to understand. I stepped back, suddenly feeling dizzy, the world around me starting to spin. A flash of movement caught my eye. It was quick, just a blur in the corner of my vision, but it was enough to send a jolt of panic through me. I turned, heart pounding, expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. But again, there was nothing. Except the air was different now. It wasn't just the oppressive silence, it was as if the air itself had thickened, become charged with an energy I couldn't explain. The walls of the ruins felt closer, as if they were closing in on me, their jagged edges pressing against my mind. My pulse raced, and I realized my breath was shallow, quick. I couldn't stay here. I had to leave. But as I turned to walk back toward the entrance, I froze. The footprints were back. But these weren't the strange, clawed prints I had seen earlier. These were different. They were deeper, like something had been dragged through the sand. And they led to the stone altar. My chest tightened. I didn't want to look at the altar again. I didn't want to see what I knew was waiting there, just beyond my line of sight. But my legs moved of their own accord, and before I could stop myself, I was standing in front of it once more. There, in the center of the altar, was something new. A dark, slick shape, like something that had been placed there in haste. It was hard to make out, but as I stepped closer, my eyes widening with dread, I saw it, two glowing red eyes staring back at me from the darkness. The ground trembled beneath my feet, and the chanting reached a crescendo, echoing in my skull. It wasn't just a sound now, it was a presence. A pulse, a vibration in the air that threatened to tear at my sanity. Something was watching me. Something that had been here long before I arrived. I staggered back, panic flooding my body. My heart raced as I spun on my heels, the sound of footsteps echoing behind me. No, there was no one there. I was alone. But the footsteps, the distant, heavy thud of something moving just out of reach, was unmistakable. I ran. The ruins blurred around me as I stumbled over rocks and debris, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I had to get out. The walls seemed to shift as I passed them, the shadows growing longer and more oppressive. I burst out of the ruins and into the open desert. But as I looked back, the stone structures behind me were no longer the same. The once ancient ruins had transformed, become darker, more menacing. The air was thick with the same presence I had felt before, and the footprints, those clawed marks, were everywhere now, leading deeper into the desert. I wanted to leave, but I knew something was waiting for me. Something had been waiting for centuries. And now, it was calling to me. I couldn't escape. The desert stretched out before me, but the world felt different. The air was heavier, thick with the same ominous energy that had gripped me inside the ruins. My legs were unsteady, and my heart was pounding so loudly I was sure it would give me away to whatever was out there, lurking just beyond the reach of my senses. I had to get to my car. I had to leave. But as I turned to head back toward the road, my gaze swept over the ruins once more. The stones were dark now, as though something had seeped into them, transforming them from ancient relics into something living, breathing, aware. The footprints, the deep, clawed impressions in the sand, had multiplied. They seemed to circle around the ruins like a grotesque ritualistic pattern. I told myself it was all in my head. The heat, the isolation, the sudden pressure building in the air, all of it had to be a result of my exhaustion and fear. There was no other explanation. But the closer I got to my car, the more impossible it seemed to escape. The ruins behind me, those monstrous walls that had once felt like history, were now a looming presence, as if they had grown taller, closer, since I had entered them. The night was darker, colder, and the wind had returned, but now it sounded like a whisper, distant voices tangled within the gusts. I froze. I wasn't alone. It was impossible to mistake the feeling of eyes on me, cold, watching, hungry. I whipped around, half expecting to see a person standing just outside the reach of my headlights, but there was nothing. Only the endless desert, stretching out toward the horizon. But then, in the corner of my vision, something shifted. A figure. Not a person, more like a shadow, an outline that didn't belong in the world I knew. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed to bend at odd angles. I didn't see its face, but I felt it, its presence. Like a dark stain against the backdrop of the night sky, it loomed in the distance, just beyond the edge of the ruins. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. My car. I needed to get to the car. I started to run, but the sand underfoot shifted in ways I couldn't explain. It was as though the ground itself was trying to pull me down, like the earth had suddenly become a living thing and it wanted me to stay. The footsteps, the deep, dragging thuds, were behind me now, moving faster, closer. I looked back. The figure was closer. I couldn't see it clearly, only the outline, the movement of its limbs, as though it was gliding through the air rather than walking. Its form twisted and writhed in a way that defied logic, as if it was made from the same shadows that clung to the ruins. My eyes couldn't focus on it fully. It was like it was constantly changing, shifting, never remaining in one place. I tried to scream, but no sound came. My voice felt stolen, buried somewhere deep inside me, as if it had been erased by the very presence of the thing that pursued me. I had reached my car, but as I fumbled for the door handle, the metal felt cold in my hand, colder than it had ever been. I yanked at the door, but it wouldn't open. I pulled harder, desperate, but it was as though the lock had melted away, sealed shut by some invisible force. And then I heard it. The whispering. It wasn't the wind anymore. It was clear, unmistakable, and it came from all around me. Words. I couldn't understand them, but they weren't meant for me. They were old, ancient, and they seemed to vibrate through the ground, through my bones. A low, guttural hum seemed to emanate from the ruins, and I realized it wasn't just the wind. It was the stones. The rocks themselves were alive with something that had been sleeping for centuries, waiting for the right moment to awaken. My heart hammered in my chest as I felt the air tighten around me. The figure was closer now, so close that I could feel its presence on my skin, as if it was pressing against me, suffocating me with its dark, unnatural force. I turned back to the ruins, suddenly desperate to understand what I was dealing with. But before I could take a step, I saw something else. A hand. It wasn't just a hand, it was a claw. Long, thin fingers that twisted in on themselves, the nails sharp like razors. The hand emerged from the stone, as though the very walls were giving birth to it, and I screamed. I slammed my body into the car door, trying once more to open it, but it felt as though the car was rooted to the spot, stuck in place by some dark force. The hand, no, the thing, was emerging fully now, its form pulling itself from the stone in a grotesque display of unnatural movement. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what I could do. The figure reached out for me, its limbs extending unnaturally, stretching farther than should have been possible. Its eyes, those glowing red eyes, stared at me with an unblinking hunger, and for a moment, I thought I saw something beyond them. A void. A place where the world didn't exist, a space where the darkness could swallow me whole. And then it spoke. Not in words, but in thoughts. In my mind. I felt it inside me, its cold voice gnawing at my sanity. You were never meant to leave. The air around me seemed to crack, and with a jolt, I was pulled forward, away from my car, my feet sliding across the sand as if gravity itself had changed. The ruins loomed in front of me, their twisted forms growing larger, taller, like the ancient stones were coming to life, eager to claim me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't scream. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The whispers faded. The shadow disappeared. The earth returned to its usual stillness. But I knew then, I was not alone. And I would never be alone again. The darkness had claimed me, and it would not let me go. When I woke, I was no longer in the desert. I wasn't sure where I was, but the air felt different, thick, oppressive, almost suffocating. The familiar warmth of the desert sun was gone, replaced by a stifling, cold dampness. My body was heavy, like it had been dragged, pulled through some dark, unseen force. I was lying on a cold, stone surface. The sound of my breath echoed back to me as if the space around me was vast, empty, and hollow. My eyes blinked open, but the darkness around me felt suffocating. The kind of dark that you can't escape, the kind that presses on your chest and fills your lungs with fear. I could barely make out the faint outlines of the walls surrounding me, stone walls, covered in a slick, oily sheen, their surfaces cracked and worn by time. For a moment, I tried to convince myself it was just a dream. That this couldn't be real. That I'd somehow passed out in the desert, in some delirious state, and was hallucinating. But the cold stone beneath me, the faint drip of water somewhere in the distance, the stale air, I knew it wasn't a dream. I was trapped. I struggled to stand, my limbs weak and shaky. The air felt thick in my lungs, like it was trying to keep me down. I stumbled forward, trying to find my bearings, but the space around me seemed to shift, the shadows playing tricks on my eyes. Everything felt alive. And then I heard it. A whisper. A voice. It wasn't human. It was deep, guttural, like something ancient, something that had been dormant for millennia. The sound seemed to vibrate through my body, making the air itself ripple with its power. I froze. You're not meant to be here. The voice was cold, unfeeling, and I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, a sickening wave of dread spreading through me. My thoughts, once coherent, began to scatter, falling into fragments as the voice continued, speaking directly into my mind, louder now, its presence almost tangible. You walk the path. Now you belong. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't in control anymore. I had stepped into something far older, far more powerful than anything I had ever understood. The ruins, the stones, the thing that had pursued me in the desert, it wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't a dream. It was real. And I had been drawn into its web. The air around me seemed to pulse with life, and the shadows began to shift. No longer were they just dark patches, they were moving. Slowly at first, but with an unmistakable purpose. Something was coming. My pulse raced as I backed away, my hand reaching out for anything to steady myself. My fingers brushed against the wall, and the slickness of the stone chilled me. I looked around, panic rising in my chest. Where was I? How had I gotten here? The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They were everywhere now, filling the air, suffocating me, until I couldn't tell where they came from. The shadows moved closer, their shapes becoming more defined. They weren't just shadows, they were figures. Silhouettes of beings that I couldn't comprehend, with limbs that twisted and bent in ways that defied logic. I tried to run, but my legs felt like they were moving through molasses, heavy and slow. The figures were all around me now, their forms coming into sharper focus, as though they were materializing from the very stone itself. Their eyes glowed, red and unblinking, watching me with a hunger I could feel deep in my bones. The voice spoke again. The ritual is not complete. You are the last piece. I didn't understand. I didn't want to understand. But the dread was suffocating. The closer the figures came, the more I realized the full extent of what I had unleashed. This wasn't just a place. This was a tomb, a prison. The figures around me weren't just shadows, they were the guardians, the protectors, and they were here to finish what had been started. I was part of something ancient, something that had been sealed away long ago. And now, I had unwittingly opened the door. My breath hitched, and I could feel the blood drain from my face as the truth began to settle in. There was no escape. I had become a part of their world. The shadows reached for me, their twisted hands snaking out with inhuman speed. I felt the cold fingers close around my wrist, pulling me toward them. My body, already weak from the desert heat and terror, couldn't resist. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My mind was consumed by the deafening hum of the voice inside me, urging me to embrace my fate. You belong. And then, as the darkness swallowed me whole, I knew there would be no return, no rescue, no end. The ritual had begun, and I was the final sacrifice. The coldness crept deeper, seeping into my bones. I tried to scream again, but the air was thick with something heavier than silence. It was a suffocating pressure, as if the very act of breathing was a betrayal, as though the stone walls were drawing in all sound, leaving only the whispers of ancient voices. The figures surrounding me, if you could even call them figures, were not bound by the laws of reality. Their forms shifted in and out of existence like broken reflections, never fully solid, yet undeniably present. Their glowing eyes were the only constant, burning through the darkness with an unholy hunger. Each movement, each step they took, made the air vibrate with an unnatural hum, a frequency that sent shards of pain through my skull. The sensation was unbearable, but I could do nothing but stand there, paralyzed by terror. A voice, not my own but intertwined with my thoughts, spoke from within me, though it was not something I wanted to hear. You are a part of this now. They will not stop. They will feed. I felt a sharp tug on my wrist, pulling me further into the maze of stone and shadow. My legs gave way beneath me, and I stumbled, unable to find my footing. The coldness of the stone ground scraped against my palms as I tried to catch myself. But no matter how hard I struggled, no matter how much I begged my body to move, my limbs refused to obey. And then, I saw it. A figure in the distance. Larger than the others, its form seemed to emerge from the very stone, its body an amalgamation of shadows and twisted flesh, held together by some dark, unnatural force. Its face, if you could call it a face, was an elongated mask of death, hollow eyes fixed on me with malevolent intent. The figure raised a hand, and as it did, the shadows around me stretched, reaching for me like tendrils of darkness. I tried to move, tried to escape, but the shadows clung to me like a second skin, binding me, crushing me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I was drowning in a sea of fear and darkness. The figure spoke, its voice deep, like a growl that rattled my very soul. You are the final offering. The ritual demands it. A sickening understanding bloomed inside me. The ritual wasn't just about bringing something back. It was about feeding the hunger that had been waiting for millennia. The darkness, the figures, they weren't guardians. They were the predators. And I was the prey. I felt the first touch of their cold hands on my skin, and it was like ice piercing through my flesh. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. Only the whispers. You will join us. The darkness pressed in, and my vision blurred. Every sound, every movement was swallowed by the crushing weight of the shadows. I could feel myself fading, sinking into something deeper than death, something more terrifying. It was as though the world around me had stopped existing, and only the darkness remained. The last thing I heard before everything went silent was the voice inside my head, repeating over and over, "You belong." Dark lights. The desert air in Nevada always had a dry, almost unbearable heat, but tonight there was something different about it. The vast, endless landscape that had once seemed calm and familiar now felt suffocating, stifled under an invisible weight, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. I'd been out here for nearly a week, alone in a small cabin I rented for some peace and solitude, far from the city lights, far from the noise. I needed the silence, or so I thought. My mind had been restless lately, too many thoughts that I couldn't shake, too many memories that I couldn't forget. A retreat in the middle of nowhere seemed like the perfect way to clear my head. But the desert, the night, these felt different now. The emptiness wasn't peaceful anymore. It was oppressive. I first saw it just after sunset, in the distance, along the horizon. A strange, pulsating light flickered, glowing in odd intervals, bright, almost too bright to be natural, and then fading out as quickly as it appeared. I thought it might have been a mirage, the way the heat plays tricks on your mind, but the light didn't move like a mirage. It hovered there, steady, unnatural. At first, I thought it was just a distant car's headlights, maybe someone out here for the same reason I was. But there were no roads nearby, no trails leading toward that spot. The light remained static, but oddly compelling. It wasn't the typical glow you'd expect from anything man-made. There was no warmth to it, no heat, just an eerie chill that seemed to travel through the air toward me. I stood there, staring out into the desert, wondering if I was just tired or imagining things. But the longer I looked, the more real it became. It was almost as if the light itself was calling to me, urging me to come closer. It wasn't until the third night that I could no longer resist. The light beckoned in the distance again, even brighter, more intense than before. It wasn't just a flicker now, it was steady, an unearthly glow that seemed to stretch out of the ground itself. There was something about it that felt wrong, but at the same time, it was almost impossible to look away. My curiosity was overpowering, and despite the growing sense of unease, I grabbed a flashlight and decided to investigate. The walk across the desert felt longer than it should have. Each step I took was slow, deliberate, as though I was moving through thick mud rather than sand. The closer I got, the more intense the light became. My heart raced. I had no rational explanation for it, but I knew deep down that something was off. As I reached the place where the light seemed to be coming from, I stopped dead in my tracks. The ground was cracked and dry, the air thick with the stench of something decaying. But the light, now that I was close enough to touch it, was completely still, almost solid. It hung in the air like an apparition, no source to be found, and yet it was undeniably there, illuminating the space around me with its unsettling glow. I raised my hand, reaching out toward it instinctively, as if it was calling to me. And then, just as my fingers brushed against the light, a sharp, sudden pain shot through my body. It was as though every nerve in me had been electrified. The light, once soft and inviting, became searing, like 1,000 burning needles piercing my skin. I jerked my hand back, gasping for air, my chest heaving with a sudden surge of panic. My heart pounded in my ears as I stumbled back, trying to regain my composure. But it was too late. The world around me had already started to change. The once quiet desert was now filled with whispers, low, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from every direction. The sound was everywhere, and it seemed to grow louder with every passing second. I spun around, desperately searching for the source, but there was nothing. Only the light, and the whispers that now felt like they were crawling inside my mind, digging through my thoughts. The shadows grew longer, darker, more defined, and I could see shapes moving within them, twisting and shifting, just out of sight, but never truly disappearing. A chill ran down my spine as the whispers turned into words, distorted and broken. "Come closer. Stay with us." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just a strange phenomenon. There was something here. Something that wanted me to stay. But I had no idea what would happen if I did. I turned to run, my legs barely carrying me across the uneven desert floor. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to get as far away from the light and the whispers as possible. But the further I moved, the more disoriented I became. The desert, once so vast and open, now seemed to close in on me, the horizon bending and warping as if it were alive. I stumbled, my foot catching on something hard in the sand, sending me sprawling to the ground. The light still pulsed behind me, brighter now, almost as if it were pursuing me. The whispers had turned into laughter, soft at first, like the distant echo of a dream, but soon louder, more insistent. "Come back," the voice taunted, a strange mix of pleasure and menace. I forced myself up, ignoring the way the ground seemed to shift beneath my feet. My heart was hammering in my chest, my pulse racing. I couldn't outrun this. Whatever it wasn't just a light or a strange weather phenomenon. It was something far older, something that didn't belong in this world. I knew I had to get back to my cabin. I couldn't think, couldn't process anything properly. I just needed to get away from this place, from whatever was calling me, twisting my mind with its unnatural pull. I don't know how much time passed before I finally made it back. The cabin was a safe distance away, but as I approached, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The shadows behind me stretched longer than they should have, almost as if they were reaching out, pulling at the edges of reality. I turned around several times, convinced that I was being followed, but the desert remained empty. Inside the cabin, I locked the door and collapsed onto the floor, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The silence that followed was deafening, almost too quiet to bear. But then came the hum, the low, persistent buzz, vibrating through the air like a tuning fork. The sound came from all around, surrounding me, coming through the walls as if the very house was alive. I stood, shaking, and checked the windows. The light outside hadn't gone away. It was still there, glowing in the distance, unwavering. It was like a beacon, drawing me back, calling me into the depths of the desert, into the place where nothing could be trusted. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that it was a natural phenomenon, something explainable that I hadn't yet figured out. But the longer I stared at the light, the more I began to doubt myself. What if it wasn't a trick? What if I had stumbled upon something ancient, something that shouldn't have been disturbed. Suddenly, a knock on the door broke my thoughts. My heart stopped. I hadn't heard anyone approach. The air outside had been still, the desert quiet. Yet someone, or something, was now on the other side of the door. Another knock, louder this time, followed by a low growl. I froze, unable to move. The whispers from outside had grown into a chorus of voices, all calling my name now, all demanding my attention. I couldn't hear them clearly, but I knew the words they spoke were dark, twisted, and full of hunger. I approached the door slowly, every muscle in my body tense, my breath shallow. I looked through the peephole, but I saw nothing. No one was there, and yet I could feel the presence on the other side, pressing against the door, filling the space with an invisible weight. Without thinking, I grabbed the handle and flung the door open. There was nothing but darkness. The desert stretched out before me, empty and silent, but the light was gone. The hum had stopped. The air was still. But the silence didn't feel like relief. It felt like a warning. I stepped outside, the ground cold beneath my feet. The world was quiet, too quiet. There were no sounds of wildlife, no wind, no movement. Just a heavy stillness that seemed to suffocate the life around me. Then, I saw them. Shapes. Figures, standing at the edge of the glow. They weren't human, or at least not fully. Tall, hunched, with limbs that twisted and bent in ways that defied logic. Their faces were a blur of shifting features, constantly changing, never staying still, but their eyes, those were the only thing I could focus on. Eyes that gleamed with an unnatural, eerie light, locked on me. A voice, no, a chorus of voices, spoke in unison, and the words they said sent a chill through my spine. You are ours. I stumbled back, trying to retreat into the cabin, but the shadows moved faster than I could. They were no longer just silhouettes, they were solid, closing in on me, surrounding me, pressing against my very soul. The light was gone, replaced by an overwhelming darkness that seemed to stretch beyond the horizon. The world had twisted, and I had no idea what was real anymore. As the first figure reached out toward me, its long, clawed fingers brushing my skin, I knew there was no escape. The desert, the light, the figures, they were all part of this nightmare. I wasn't meant to leave. No one was meant to leave. And in that moment, I understood. The desert had claimed me. The claws grazed my arm, and an icy jolt of panic surged through me. It felt as though the touch had frozen me from the inside, as though something ancient and terrible had rooted itself deep into my core. I couldn't breathe, couldn't scream, couldn't move. My body was paralyzed, but my mind was racing, terrified, struggling for a way out. I tried to pull away, but the figure's grip tightened. The hand, if that's what it even was no longer just cold. It burned with a strange, otherworldly heat. The pressure around my arm felt like it was crushing my bones. The air around me seemed to thicken, each breath harder than the last. I turned my head, glancing back at the others, the shifting shadows, all of them now slowly advancing. Their eyes, those eyes, pierced into me, hollow and deep, like an abyss staring back into my soul. The voices were getting louder, more distinct now, as if they were feeding off my fear, drawing strength from it. Come closer, come with us, they whispered, their voices coiling around my thoughts, slithering into my mind. The words were too familiar, too inviting, and I felt a strange pull, a desire to step into the darkness. But part of me knew I had to fight it. With all the strength I could muster, I slammed my foot into the ground, breaking free from the figure's grasp. I stumbled backward, falling to my knees, gasping for air. The darkness around me pulsed, as though it were alive, the space between the figures filled with a tension that hummed in the air. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding in my chest, but my legs were like jelly, weak and unsteady. I had no plan, no escape, just instinct pushing me forward. I ran. I didn't look back, couldn't afford to. The desert stretched before me, its vast emptiness now more suffocating than ever. The landscape had become a maze of shadows, each corner hiding something, some unimaginable terror. The light, the one that had drawn me here, was nowhere to be seen. And yet, I could still feel it, its pull, like a faint memory tugging at the edges of my consciousness. "Where are you?" I thought desperately. "Where did you go?" I stumbled across the jagged rocks, barely aware of the ground beneath me. My thoughts were spiraling, a mix of fear and confusion. Was this real? Or was I losing my mind? The desert had been empty just moments ago. Now, it was alive with movements I couldn't understand, things that shouldn't exist. The whispers continued, an unholy symphony. "Leave the light behind. Come into the dark." I shook my head, trying to block them out, but they were everywhere I turned, every breath I took. I couldn't escape them. I couldn't escape the feeling that something was inside me, something foreign and ancient, manipulating my thoughts, distorting my sense of time and space. Then, without warning, the world around me shifted again. The desert, the rocks, the air, all of it twisted, warped. The stars above flickered out, and the ground beneath me began to melt. The sand sank, as if the earth itself was swallowing me whole. "No!" I screamed. "This can't be happening." But it was. It was happening. I tried to move, to escape, but my legs wouldn't obey. The shadows were everywhere now, closer than before, surrounding me, pulling me down into the depths. I felt the weight of them pressing against me, closing in. The figures were all around, their voices filling my mind. They weren't just watching now, they were in my head, invading my thoughts, guiding my every action. "We're waiting for you," they sang. I was suffocating. The air was thick, like it had substance, a presence pressing against my chest, making it harder to breathe. I could feel the darkness suffuse through my skin, like a cold poison, leaching the life out of me. And then, I saw it. In the distance, through the shifting fog of the desert, there was a faint glow, a faint pulse of light. It was weak, flickering, but it was there. The same light I had seen before, the one that had called me in. But now, it was dim, distant, as if it was slipping away. The whispers grew louder. "Come closer, the light will save you." I started walking toward it, drawn to it, even though I knew better. My feet moved of their own accord, as though they belonged to someone else. The figures still circled, but now they seemed further away, like they were losing their grip on me. The light was the answer. But the closer I got, the less certain I became. The shadows, those terrible, impossible shadows, weren't fading. They were growing. And that faint glow in the distance? It wasn't light anymore. It was a trap. The moment I realized it, I tried to stop, to turn away. But it was too late. The desert, the light, the shadows, they had all fused together, becoming one inescapable nightmare. I wasn't going to make it out. I wasn't even sure I was still me anymore. The world had turned into something else, something ancient and dark, and I was just a part of it now. The last thing I felt was the ground beneath me breaking apart as the darkness swallowed me whole. And then, nothing. I don't know how much time passed. Minutes? Hours? Or was it days? The concept of time had become as meaningless as everything else. The air was still thick, the oppressive weight of it pressing down on me as though the earth itself had decided to take me back into its ancient, lifeless embrace. My body ached, but there was something else, something worse than physical pain. A deep sense of emptiness. It wasn't just exhaustion or fear, it was as though my soul had been stripped bare, leaving only a hollow shell behind. I felt disconnected, disjointed from the world I once knew. The harsh, burning light of the desert had faded, and now I found myself in the dark, surrounded by silence, with only the distant echoes of the whispering voices that had followed me. You are here. You belong. Come to us. The voices lingered, always just out of reach, but somehow they filled the void. I couldn't escape them. They were my reality now. I blinked, struggling to focus. The surroundings were alien. The sand was gone, replaced by a strange, almost viscous substance beneath my feet. The world around me had become a distorted, nightmarish landscape, twisted shapes and shifting shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. There were no stars, no moon, just an endless expanse of dark. The kind of darkness that choked out even the thought of light. Where was I? What had happened to the desert? What had happened to the light? I stumbled forward, my legs unsteady, as though they no longer belonged to me. The ground beneath me felt alive, soft, pulsating like a living thing. The figures, they were still here, moving in the corners of my vision. The strange, glowing eyes watching me from the darkness. But they were distant now, almost like memories I couldn't fully grasp. It was as though they had faded into the very landscape, becoming part of it. The smell was rancid, thick and stifling, filling my nostrils and making me gag. I could feel something crawling across the ground beneath me, but when I looked, there was nothing there. Just the shadows, moving in ways they shouldn't. And then, the light returned. It was faint, flickering like a dying ember, but it was real. I could feel it calling to me once more, a distant beacon in this sea of darkness. No, not again. I knew I shouldn't follow it, but my feet were already moving before I could even think. I couldn't stop myself. The pull was too strong, too familiar. It promised escape, salvation. But deep down, I knew better now. I knew the truth. It's a trap, I whispered to myself, but the words didn't sound like mine. They sounded foreign, as though spoken by someone else trapped inside my head. I stopped for a moment, trying to collect my thoughts, but the voices grew louder. My head pounded, as though my skull was splitting in two. My vision blurred. I could feel the presence of the figures pressing in around me again, closer this time. I looked down at my hands. They were wrong. The skin was pale, almost translucent, like it had been drained of color. My fingers moved, but it felt unnatural. Foreign. I couldn't even recognize the person in front of me anymore. The very idea of me seemed distant, fading away into nothingness. Something shifted behind me. A breath. The soft whisper of movement in the dark. I turned around quickly, but there was nothing there. Only the shadows. Only the ever-present darkness that pressed in on me from every direction. And then, it happened. The light flared brighter, casting long, stretching shadows that writhed and twisted. But it wasn't the light I remembered. It wasn't soft and inviting. It was harsh, blinding, its glow searing through my eyes, burning into my mind. The shadows moved in response, growing, contorting into shapes that should never have existed. I tried to run, but my body refused to obey. It was like my legs were trapped in quicksand. The more I struggled, the more they sank. The light pulsed again, faster now, a maddening rhythm that seemed to be beating in time with my heart. "Come closer," the voices crooned, their words now an overwhelming chant. No. I couldn't. I wouldn't. But my feet continued moving, and the world around me began to bend. The ground cracked open beneath me, and I fell. A long, terrible fall, deeper and deeper into the abyss. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My body was weightless, suspended in that endless, choking darkness. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The fall. The movement. The voices. The light. I opened my eyes. I was on the ground, gasping for air, but the air was different now, stale, thick with the remnants of something I couldn't comprehend. The world around me was still dark, but it was quieter. The figures, the light, the desert, they were gone. And yet, something was watching me. I could feel it. The air felt wrong. Heavy. I tried to stand, but my legs were weak, unsteady. I looked around, desperate to make sense of what had happened. I was back in the desert. Or was it? The landscape was unfamiliar, and yet I recognized it, the jagged rocks, the dark sky above. It was as though time itself had fractured, split into pieces I couldn't put back together. And then, in the distance, the faintest flicker of light. The same pull. The same call. It was waiting for me. And I knew, with a sickening certainty, that I couldn't escape it. I took a step forward. And the ground beneath me shifted. The sensation was familiar, like sinking into quicksand, but this time the pull was different. It was no longer the magnetic, irresistible force I had felt before. Now, it felt like a trap closing in around me. The light in the distance flickered again, pulling me in, but this time my instincts screamed to resist. "Don't go, don't follow it," I whispered to myself, but the words sounded hollow, swallowed up by the desert wind that howled around me. I stumbled, almost falling, my hands reaching out to steady myself against the shifting sand. The desert stretched out endlessly before me, but the darkness felt closer, tighter. The once familiar landscape had become alien, twisted, and unnatural. And then, the light flared again, brighter this time. The pulse of it seemed to reverberate through my very bones, setting my heart racing. The air was thick, almost choking, and the scent of decay filled my nostrils. Every instinct told me to turn around, to run, but my body refused to obey. My legs moved on their own, carrying me toward the beckoning glow. "No," I gasped, but it was too late. I had already crossed the threshold. As I stepped forward, the world around me warped. The desert disappeared, replaced by a strange, twisted landscape that felt more like a nightmare than reality. Shadows flickered across the ground, stretching unnaturally long, crawling up the jagged rocks like living things. The air grew thick, humid, heavy with something ancient and malevolent. The light had intensified, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a figure standing in the center of it. A silhouette, tall and distorted, its features hidden by the blinding glow. "You've come." The voice was a low, guttural murmur, not spoken but felt, like a presence vibrating through my chest. I froze. The voice wasn't just in my ears, it was inside my head. It filled every inch of my mind, overwhelming every thought. "You are one of us now," the voice whispered again, and this time I felt the words wrap around me like a suffocating fog. The light pulsed again, and the figure in the center began to move, its form shifting, flickering like a mirage. It was as if it were made of the very light itself, impossible to define, stretching and twisting in ways that defied the laws of nature. I tried to look away, to escape, but my body wouldn't respond. My limbs were frozen in place, my mind trapped in the ever-expanding void of this unholy light. "Join us," the voice coaxed, low and inviting, but there was something sinister behind it, a darkness hiding in the depths of its tone. I didn't want to. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But my thoughts had become fragmented, slipping through my fingers like sand. My breath came in shallow gasps, each one more difficult than the last. I tried to force my legs to move, but the weight of the presence in front of me was unbearable. The darkness around me deepened, and for the first time since I had entered this cursed place, I realized just how alone I was. The ground trembled beneath me, the very earth shaking as if it were about to tear itself apart. I looked down, and to my horror, I saw cracks forming in the sand, jagged and sharp. They spread quickly, splitting the desert like a giant scar. And then, from the depths of those cracks, I saw them, figures. They emerged slowly at first, tall and imposing, their forms shrouded in shadows. As they moved closer, their faces became visible, but they were not human. Their eyes were black voids, endless pits that seemed to suck in the light around them. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, and their limbs elongated unnaturally. They were like ghosts, hollow, soulless. And then, the figure in the center of the light stepped forward, its form sharpening into something more recognizable, an ancient being, covered in strange symbols that glowed faintly against its dark skin. Its eyes were nothing but empty sockets, and its mouth, if you could even call it that, split wide, revealing rows of jagged, inhuman teeth. "You have come too far to turn back," the voice whispered once more, the sound vibrating through the ground and into my bones. I tried to scream, but the words died in my throat. My mouth had gone dry. My vision swam, and the world around me blurred. The figures around me closed in, their movements slow and deliberate, like hunters circling their prey. I could feel their cold, lifeless gaze on me, and the weight of their presence pressed down on my chest. I struggled to breathe, but it felt as though the very air had thickened to a near impossible density. "You are one of us," the voice repeated, and this time I understood. The light, this strange, unholy light, hadn't just been pulling me toward it. It had been pulling me into it, turning me into something else, something part of this world. My body, my mind, everything I once knew had been transformed. I wasn't human anymore. I was something else. I looked at the figures around me again, and it dawned on me this was where it had all begun. This place, this darkness, these creatures. They had been waiting for me. "Welcome home," the voice whispered again, but this time there was no fear. There was only acceptance. And then, in that final moment, I understood. The darkness hadn't taken me. It had embraced me. And now, I was one of them. The light flickered one last time, and everything went black. Crossroads of the past. I had always taken the same route through Florida, a quiet road that stretched like a lifeline through the flatlands and forests. The long stretches of asphalt, dotted with the occasional gas station or diner, were familiar and comforting. But something was off that night. I couldn't place it at first, the strange shiver running down my spine as the headlights cut through the darkened road, or the sense that something wasn't quite right. The usual hum of my car engine seemed duller, the night air thicker. It was when I reached the intersection, or run-down crossroad at the edge of nowhere, that I began to feel the unease settle deeper into my bones. This intersection had never been much of a landmark. It was a forgotten place, marked only by faded road signs and a cracked, weather-beaten asphalt path that seemed like it hadn't been used in years. But tonight, the road felt different. I pulled to a stop, glancing at the empty highway on either side. The place looked abandoned, even more so than usual. There were no cars in sight, no flickering streetlights, no sign of life. But then I saw it, a single car parked on the side of the road, its headlights dimming as though it had been left there for a while. I frowned, squinting into the darkness. The car was old, its body rusted and covered in grime. It looked as though it hadn't been touched in decades. It didn't belong there. There was no reason for anyone to be here, especially not in the dead of night. I was about to drive on, but something stopped me. A gut instinct, or maybe just a lingering curiosity. I turned the wheel and parked beside the abandoned vehicle, my engine cutting off with a sputter as the silence enveloped me. I glanced over at the car again, this time feeling a strange pull toward it. A figure was sitting inside. It was hard to make out through the fogged-up windows, but the silhouette was unmistakable. A man. No, a shadow of a man, hunched over, almost as if waiting. I couldn't see his face, but the feeling of being watched crept over me, the kind of chill that sinks deep into your skin. I shifted in my seat, unsure whether to stay or leave, but before I could decide, a voice broke the silence. Need some help? I jumped, my heart skipping a beat. The man was standing outside my window, his face hidden by the brim of a hat. He was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, as though he had stepped out of a different time. His appearance, or perhaps the way he carried himself, struck me as out of place. Everything about him felt wrong. He didn't seem to notice my hesitation. It's an easy road if you know the way, he said, his voice gravelly but not unkind. But this intersection, it's tricky. Sometimes people get lost here. I looked at him, my mind racing to make sense of the situation. How had he appeared so suddenly? I hadn't seen him walking toward my car, and there was no other vehicle around for miles. Lost? I repeated, unsure how to respond. He nodded, stepping closer, his shoes scuffing against the cracked pavement. You wouldn't be the first. Time doesn't behave the same here. Neither does the road. I furrowed my brow. What are you talking about? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gestured to the road behind me. I turned around and stared at the empty stretch of highway. Nothing had changed, but it felt different, as if the darkness had thickened, pressing closer around me. The man didn't wait for me to ask again. They never tell you about the crossroads. You think it's just another part of the road, but it's not. It's a place where people get stuck. Sometimes you don't even realize it until it's too late. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. There was something about his tone that made the air feel colder, heavier. He had an old-world feel to him, like he was part of the road itself, something lost to time, existing outside of reality. Do you want to get lost, too? He asked, his voice softer now, almost coaxing. I swallowed hard, trying to shake off the strange tension that had settled over me. I don't think I understand, I replied, the words coming out too quickly. He leaned closer to my window, his face still shrouded by the brim of his hat. I could barely make out his eyes, dark and hollow. You don't have to understand. You just have to follow the signs. That's the only way to find your way out. The stillness of the night pressed in on me. The wind picked up slightly, rattling the dead leaves by the roadside. I felt an overwhelming urge to drive away, to get out of there before it was too late. But something about the man's presence, his cryptic words, held me in place. Signs? I asked, voice wavering slightly. The man's lips twisted into a slow, unsettling grin. Yes. But you'll see them soon enough. If you're looking for them, that is. I glanced back at the road, and when I turned back to him, he was gone. Just like that, vanished. As though he had never been there at all. I sat there, staring at the empty spot where he had been, wondering if I had imagined him. But the unease remained, lingering in the pit of my stomach. There was no sign of the car, no trace of him. Just silence. Something was very wrong here. And the road that lay ahead, well, I wasn't sure I was ready to face what it might reveal. But I knew I had no choice but to keep moving forward. I should have driven away. That's what my gut kept telling me. But my hands, for some strange reason, wouldn't turn the key in the ignition. The man's words echoed in my mind, follow the signs. What did he mean by that? And why did it feel like there was more to this place than met the eye? I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing thoughts. The headlights from my car illuminated the road ahead, a stretch of asphalt that seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon. I checked my rearview mirror, still expecting to see the rusted old car or the man standing there, watching me. But there was nothing. No sign of life, no movement. Just the haunting stillness of the night. But something about the atmosphere felt wrong, off in a way I couldn't explain. I shifted my car into drive, the engine sputtering for a moment before it roared to life. My foot pressed on the gas, and I started down the road, but the feeling of unease never left. Minutes passed, or maybe it was hours. Time felt warped, twisted. I glanced at the clock on my dashboard. It was 2:15 a.m. But somehow, it felt like I had been driving for much longer than that. Suddenly, I noticed something ahead. A car. A bright red muscle car, parked along the shoulder of the road. But it wasn't just the car that caught my attention. It was the fact that I had seen this exact car before. It had been on the side of the road just moments ago. How could it be here again? I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as I skidded to a stop. I leaned forward in my seat, squinting at the car ahead. The same rusted old vehicle. The same faded paint. The same exact position. But there was no one inside. My heart pounded in my chest. I rolled down the window, the cool night air rushing in. The sound of crickets was deafening. I called out, expecting to hear a response, maybe the man, maybe someone else. But nothing. Just the eerie silence that seemed to suffocate everything. I glanced around, feeling the weight of the stillness pressing in on me. The crossroad where I had stopped earlier seemed different now. It wasn't just the strange absence of the man. The whole place felt like it was wrong. Time seemed to distort around me, stretching and bending in ways I couldn't grasp. And then it happened. The headlights of the red muscle car flickered on by themselves. At first, it was subtle, just a small flash of light. But then, the car's engine roared to life, its rumble shaking the ground beneath my feet. The vehicle started moving, slowly at first, as though it was coming to life. But it didn't move like a normal car. It glided smoothly, as though it were floating. I watched, frozen in place, as the car turned and began to drive down the road ahead, its headlights cutting through the dark. It didn't seem to be going anywhere. It was as if it was just passing through time. The air around me shifted. I could feel it. Something was closing in on me. I reached for my phone, but when I looked at the screen, it was just static. No bars. No signal. I was cut off, isolated. And yet, I felt as if something was watching me, lurking in the dark, waiting for me to make the wrong move. I had to follow it. I couldn't explain why I felt that way. But I knew, deep down, that whatever was happening, whatever this place was, it wasn't going to let me leave unless I followed the path. I turned the key in the ignition once again. The engine sputtered at first, hesitant, but then roared to life. My hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white with tension. With one last glance at the red car in the distance, I pressed my foot down on the gas. The road stretched before me, an endless dark expanse, but there was something comforting about it, like I wasn't entirely alone anymore. The red car was out of sight, but I knew it was ahead, just beyond the curve, waiting for me. I sped up, my heart thumping in my chest. The night outside seemed to close in tighter, the road twisting and turning in ways that didn't feel natural. The trees lining the roadside looked closer than before, their branches stretching toward the road like skeletal fingers. The air grew heavier, the tension unbearable. The car seemed to pull me forward, as if it was beckoning me, and I couldn't resist. And then, the lights started to change. At first, it was subtle, a faint glow that seemed to come from nowhere. But soon, the entire landscape around me began to shift, distorting like a funhouse mirror. The road started to ripple beneath my tires. The trees no longer looked like trees. They looked like figures that whispered in a language I couldn't understand. I slammed on the brakes as the world around me continued to bend and warp. The car jerked to a halt, tires screeching against the asphalt. I looked around in a panic, my pulse racing. The world outside was now completely different. The sky had shifted from a dark, empty expanse to an unnatural orange glow that seemed to pulse with energy. The road ahead had split into two paths, one leading into a thick fog and the other fading into a distant horizon. I was no longer on the road I knew. And then, through the fog, I saw it. A figure. A silhouette of a man standing in the middle of the road, motionless, his face hidden in shadow. The same figure I had seen earlier. My heart froze in my chest as I realized the crossroads had trapped me. The past had come back, and it wasn't about to let me leave. I couldn't move. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure standing in the middle of the road. The figure, the man I had seen earlier, his outline barely visible in the dense fog. His features were shrouded in darkness, but there was something about him that was eerily familiar. For a moment, I thought I was imagining things. Maybe it was the stress, the lack of sleep, or the fear creeping up on me like a silent predator. But as the fog thickened, his shape grew clearer. He stood there, unmoving, as though waiting for something. Waiting for me. I had to make a choice. I could turn the car around, drive back the way I came, and escape this nightmare. But somehow, deep down, I knew that wasn't an option. There was something about the crossroads, about this place, that wouldn't let me leave. The past, whatever it was pulling me in. I pressed down on the accelerator, slowly at first, inching forward toward the figure. As I neared, the man remained still, his presence becoming more imposing with every passing second. The fog clung to the ground like a living thing, swirling around the wheels of my car. Just as I was about to pass him, the figure turned. His face. I gasped, my heart slamming into my chest. His face was mine. It was a twisted reflection of myself, but not like anything I had ever seen. His eyes were hollow, black pits where pupils should be. His skin was pale, almost translucent, as though he had been trapped in this place for far too long. He smiled, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was a grin full of malice, full of knowledge that I couldn't comprehend. "You shouldn't have come back," he said, his voice low and rasping, as though it came from the depths of the earth itself. I slammed my foot on the brake, my car skidding to a stop just inches from him. My breath caught in my throat. The figure raised a hand, pointing directly at me. "You've been here before," he said, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. "And you will be here again." The words reverberated in my mind. How could that be possible? I had never seen this place before. I didn't know this road, this man. But then it hit me. A flash of memory, a whisper of a forgotten dream. I had been here before, in another life, another time. This place had called to me then, just as it was calling to me now. The crossroads were not just a physical location, they were a door to the past. I wanted to look away, to turn the car around and flee. But I couldn't. My body felt like it was frozen in place, my eyes locked on his twisted reflection. He took a slow step toward me, and I instinctively shifted the car into reverse. But as I did, the world around me began to shift again. The road behind me disappeared, swallowed by the fog, as if the past was erasing everything that came before it. "Where are you going?" the figure asked, his voice soft but cold. "There is nowhere to run from here." The fog closed in around me, thick and suffocating, and I realized something far worse than fear had taken root in my heart. This wasn't just about escaping, it was about surviving a nightmare that had no end. I glanced around, desperate to find some kind of escape, but there was no way out. The crossroads had become my prison. The world, once familiar, was now a dark and distorted version of itself. The trees, the road, the air, all of it had changed, had become something otherworldly. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw something moving. I turned my head, my stomach lurching. Another car, an old, battered vehicle, had appeared on the road. The headlights gleamed in the mist, cutting through the fog like a blade. It wasn't the red muscle car from before, but it was just as strange, just as unsettling. It stopped behind me, and the engine cut off, leaving only the sound of the fog swirling around us. The door creaked open. A figure stepped out. It was a woman, dressed in tattered clothes, her hair wild and unkempt. Her face, like the man's, was distorted, twisted into a grotesque mockery of a human expression. She moved toward my car slowly, as if drawn by some invisible force. She didn't speak, but her eyes, those hollow, dark eyes, stared straight through me, as if she knew me. "I tried to warn you," she said finally, her voice soft, almost sad. "You're part of it now. You can never leave." The air around me felt colder now, the fog thickening even further, as if the world itself was being consumed by whatever this place was. The woman stood beside the car, her fingers tapping lightly against the window. Her nails were long, jagged, like claws. "You'll see," she continued, her voice distant, as though she were speaking to herself. "You'll see how it all ends." I didn't understand. How could this be happening? What was this place? What did they mean by "you're part of it now"? My mind reeled, trying to make sense of the nightmare that was unfolding before me. But as I looked back at the crossroads, the reality of it hit me like a punch to the stomach. The road, the figures, the fog, it was all the same as it had been moments ago, as if time itself was folding in on itself. The past, the present, they were all blending together. And I had become a part of it. I slammed the car into drive, the engine roaring to life again. But the road before me was no longer the one I knew. It had become a swirling vortex, a tunnel of fog and shadows that reached out to claim me. The figure of the man was no longer there, nor the woman, but I could feel their presence, their eyes, their whispers. "You shouldn't have come back," their voices echoed in my mind, the last words they would ever say to me. As I sped down the road, I realized the truth. The crossroads weren't a place, they were a trap. And I had already crossed the line between past and present. There was no turning back. The fog engulfed me completely now. It was impossible to see more than a few feet ahead, as though the road had become an endless expanse of nothingness. The car's headlights barely pierced through the dense mist, casting an eerie glow on the swirling white around me. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, and my breath came in short, frantic bursts. I had to stay focused, had to keep driving. I couldn't let the panic consume me, not now. But where was I going? The road ahead was as unfamiliar as the rest of this place, this dream, nightmare, reality. I didn't know anymore. I pressed my foot harder on the accelerator, hoping that if I drove long enough, the fog would clear and I would find my way out. But the fog thickened with every mile, every second, as though it was closing in on me. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life. A sharp burst of static followed by a voice, distant, distorted, yet clear enough to make me freeze in terror. "Don't go further." The words rang out in the quiet of the car, and I slammed my hand against the radio, desperate to turn it off. But the voice persisted. "Don't go further. They're waiting." I tried to reason with myself, tried to ignore the creeping dread clawing at my mind. It was just the radio, malfunctioning. The signal had to be off, the reception breaking through some forgotten static. But I knew, deep down, that it was more than that. The voice wasn't just coming from the radio. It was in the air, all around me, whispering, "They're waiting for you, at the end of the road." I felt the car lurch as I hit something. The tires screeched, and I veered to the side, heart pounding, barely able to control the wheel. I slammed the brakes, bringing the car to a stop. My hands were slick with sweat, my chest heaving. I hadn't seen anything in front of me, no warning, nothing. But then, as I glanced out of the window, I saw it. A door. It stood at the side of the road, a wooden door, old and weathered, standing alone in the middle of the fog. There was no building around it, no structure, it was just there, waiting. My heart skipped a beat. I couldn't explain it, couldn't rationalize why it was there. But it beckoned me. Before I could decide what to do, the door creaked open, slowly, as though someone on the other side was inviting me in. A faint glow emerged from within, casting a pale, ghostly light on the fog around it. And then, just like that, I saw them. Figures. Moving shapes, faint at first, but slowly becoming clearer, more solid. They stood just beyond the door, their faces obscured by shadows. They were waiting for me. I knew it instinctively, as if I had been expected all along. My pulse quickened, my body paralyzed with fear. I wanted to turn away, to drive as far and as fast as possible, but my hands remained frozen to the wheel. The door called to me, pulled at something deep inside me, something that I couldn't explain or fight. Go, the voice on the radio whispered again, this time clear, urgent. They're waiting. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. But the door, it wasn't just a door. It was a threshold, an invitation to something beyond the edge of my understanding. Something ancient. Something that had been waiting for me. And just like that, my foot lifted from the brake. I wasn't in control anymore. The car started moving again, its tires slowly rolling forward toward the door. The figures were closer now. I could see their outlines, their movements slow, deliberate, as though they knew exactly when I would arrive. The fog closed in around me, making everything appear surreal, like I was floating, drifting through time, or perhaps out of it. The door creaked open wider, and I couldn't stop myself from driving closer. The figures in the doorway remained still, their faces hidden in shadow, their presence suffocating. They didn't need to speak. Their silence was enough to make my skin crawl. Suddenly, I understood. This wasn't just a road. This wasn't just a place. This was a moment frozen in time, a point where past, present, and future converged. And these figures, these silent watchers, they weren't from any one time. They were remnants of every moment lost to history, of every lost traveler, every forgotten soul who had passed through this place and never left. I was one of them now. The realization hit me like a wave crashing against the shore, cold and inevitable. I tried to fight it, tried to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. My car was moving on its own, pulling closer to the door, drawing me toward the figures, toward my fate. My breath came out in ragged gasps, but I couldn't stop it. The door loomed closer, its edges glowing brighter, the shadows inside deeper, darker. The figures began to move again, stepping forward as though they knew exactly what was about to happen. And then, just as I reached the threshold of the door, the world around me shifted once more. The car lurched to a halt, but I didn't move. I couldn't. I was no longer alone. The world fell silent. The car had stopped, the engine's hum dying away, and the air was thick with an unnatural stillness. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze, the figures in the doorway, the fog swirling in the distance, the faint light spilling out from the threshold. Time, I thought, had stopped entirely. I was no longer sure where I was, or what I was. I tried to breathe, but the air felt dense, as though each inhale took an effort far beyond normal. My heart hammered in my chest, and my mind raced with frantic thoughts. What now? I had no way of explaining what was happening, no way of rationalizing the impossible situation I found myself in. And yet, in the pit of my stomach, I knew I had no choice but to move forward. The figures were closer now, but I still couldn't make out their faces. They were shapes, silhouettes in the dim light, but they were unmistakably human. I could feel their presence, an ancient, oppressive energy that seemed to suck the warmth from the air. They didn't move as I approached, but I could sense them, waiting as though they had always been there and would always be there. Watching. Silent. One of them stepped forward. I tensed, my body instinctively recoiling, but I couldn't move. My eyes were locked on the figure as it drew closer. The shape was tall, its movements slow and deliberate. And then, as it came into the light, I saw its face, or rather, the absence of it. A smooth, featureless mask of skin. No eyes, no mouth. Just a blank, pale surface where a face should have been. My breath caught in my throat, a wave of nausea hitting me as I stared at it. The figure didn't speak. It didn't need to. The silence between us felt suffocating, pressing against my mind, squeezing the air out of my lungs. It reached toward me, its hand elongated, fingers too long, too thin. I wanted to pull away, to scream, but my body refused to listen. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The hand hovered just inches from my face. I could feel the coldness emanating from it, the sensation of it pressing against my skin without touching me. The figure's presence filled the car. The world seemed to spin, warping and shifting in and out of focus. The more I stared, the more I felt like I was losing myself in it, dissolving into the fog, into the shadows. And then the voice came again, not from the radio this time, but from the figure. It was soft, a whisper that cut through the silence like a blade. You've crossed the threshold. You are part of the road now. The words sent a chill down my spine. I couldn't make sense of them, couldn't understand what they meant. But it didn't matter. The truth was clear in that moment. I had already stepped too far into whatever this was. There was no going back. A sound broke through the stillness, a low rumble like thunder, but deeper, more unsettling. I glanced around, but there was no storm, no clouds on the horizon. The road ahead stretched on, disappearing into the fog, but the figures in the doorway remained, as still and unmoving as statues. "Do you want to go back?" the figure asked, its voice now rising, as though it knew my thoughts, as though it knew what I wanted. I did. I wanted to go back. I wanted to leave this place, to return to the world I knew, the world where things made sense. But deep inside, I knew that I couldn't. I didn't even know if it was possible. "I can never go back," I whispered, more to myself than to the figure. The words felt like an acceptance, as though I had finally understood that the road I had driven down wasn't just some random stretch of highway. It was a path that led to a place beyond understanding, a place where time and space twisted and bent. A place where people, and places, and moments, everything, could be lost forever. The figure's hand lowered slowly, the pale mask tilting slightly as if it were studying me. Then, without a word, it stepped back. The others followed suit, retreating into the shadows of the doorway. And then, the door began to close. I wanted to scream, to beg them to leave it open, to let me escape before it was too late. But I couldn't. I was frozen, paralyzed by the weight of the moment, by the realization that I had crossed the line between the living and the lost. The last thing I saw before the door clicked shut was the face of one of the figures, a face I had never seen before, but one that seemed oddly familiar, like it belonged to someone I had known in another time. Someone I had forgotten. And then, darkness. The next breath I took was on my own. The air felt foreign, suffocating, as if I had been transported into a space that wasn't mine. The car was gone. The figures were gone. The road was gone. I was standing in an empty field, the ground beneath my feet soft and uneven, the fog swirling around me like smoke. I couldn't tell how long I had been standing there, lost in a place that made no sense. I couldn't remember how I had gotten there, or why I was here. But one thing was certain, I wasn't the same person who had driven down that road. I had become part of it now, part of whatever this place was, this intersection of time and memory. And in the distance, beyond the mist, I could hear the sound of footsteps. Someone was coming. I wasn't sure if I was ready to face them, but I had no choice. wall without shadows. It started as a whisper, just a passing conversation between neighbors, a strange mention of a wall in the middle of nowhere. No one thought much of it at first. People in the small town of Santa Rosa, New Mexico, had seen their fair share of oddities, but this was different. This wall wasn't just another abandoned relic of the past, it was something that couldn't be explained. I first heard about it from Ray, the old mechanic down at the garage. He was hunched over his workbench, wiping grease off his hands when he casually mentioned the wall. "You heard about the thing up on Old Route 40? Ray asked, his voice low. He glanced around, making sure no one else was listening. "A wall that doesn't cast a shadow." I didn't think much of it. People around here like to talk about strange things, half-baked rumors, and ghost stories, most of them untrue. But Ray wasn't the type to joke about such matters. And when he saw the confusion on my face, his expression grew serious. "It's true," he said. "I saw it myself. You can stand right next to it, hell, you can touch it, but you won't see a damn thing. No shadow. Not a flicker." The idea of a shadowless wall seemed ludicrous, yet the way Ray spoke, like it was something out of a nightmare, made me wonder. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, something simple, like a mirage. Still, something about his tone bothered me, gnawed at me long after I left the garage. I didn't expect to see it myself. In fact, I tried to push it out of my mind. That was until I found myself on Old Route 40 that evening, my car humming down the empty stretch of highway, the golden hour sunlight turning the desert landscape into an orange blur. I had been on this road countless times before, too many to count, but today, there was something different about it. The sky looked heavier, darker, and the air felt thick, like the very atmosphere had been tampered with. As I rounded a bend in the road, there it was. At first, I thought it was just an illusion, a mirage. The wall stood at the edge of the desert, a tall, imposing structure, far too perfect in shape to be natural. It was made of rough stone, weathered by time but somehow untouched by the wind and sand that usually wore down everything around here. It was about 10 feet high, taller than anything I had ever seen in this part of New Mexico. And then I saw it. The absence of something. No shadow. The wall stood there in the bright light of the setting sun, and yet there was no shadow cast. Not a flicker of darkness at its base. Not even the faintest outline in the shifting light. It was as though it didn't exist in the same plane as everything else. I stopped my car, the engine idling softly, and stared at it. My breath caught in my throat. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine, but I tried to shake it off. It had to be some sort of illusion, right? A trick of the light, maybe. Some kind of optical phenomenon. But no matter how hard I stared, no matter where I stood, the wall remained shadowless. I stepped out of the car, my boots crunching on the gravel. The air was unnaturally still. There wasn't even the hum of insects, no sound of wind. Just silence. And the wall, standing there like it had always been, and would always be. I walked closer to it, reaching out a hand, hesitant. My fingers brushed the rough stone surface. It was cool to the touch, but there was something unsettling about it. Something wrong. I couldn't explain it. The sensation lingered, creeping under my skin. Then, I looked up, expecting to see the usual play of light as the sun's rays hit the surface of the wall. But no, there was nothing. No shadow. Not even the faintest hint of change in the light around me. My heart began to race. Something in me told me I shouldn't be here. that I should turn back. But I couldn't. I had to understand it. I had to know what was happening. My thoughts scrambled as I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. It didn't make sense. Ray was right, I muttered to myself, my voice cracking. The realization hit me with a sudden, brutal force. The wall wasn't just a trick of the light, it was something else. Something unnatural. As I stood there, my mind raced with 1,000 questions. How could something like this exist? What was it doing here, in the middle of nowhere? Suddenly, a movement caught my eye. I turned quickly, but there was nothing but the empty highway behind me. Just the road stretching out into the desert, as it had been for miles. Yet the feeling that something was wrong, something was watching, grew stronger. I turned back to the wall. There it stood, silent and motionless. But the air around me had shifted, the atmosphere thick with an unspoken tension. It was as though the very fabric of reality had been disturbed, and I was standing at the center of it. I should have left. I knew that now. But there was something in me that wanted to understand. To know the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. And then, as if the world itself had decided to reveal its secrets to me, I heard it. A soft whisper, barely audible, coming from the wall itself. A voice, distant but unmistakable, "You don't belong here." My heart stopped. It was too late to run. Something had already begun, something far beyond my understanding. And there was no escaping it. The voice was faint at first, almost as if it had been carried by the wind, but there was no wind. There was no movement in the air. The world around me had become unnervingly still, as if holding its breath. I stood there frozen, my heart hammering in my chest, every muscle in my body screaming to run, but my feet wouldn't move. "You don't belong here." The words repeated in my mind, chilling me to the bone. I looked around, but there was no one else. I was alone on the road. My breath came out in sharp gasps, my eyes frantically scanning the horizon for any sign of movement, but the desert stretched endlessly, empty and quiet. I reached out again, my fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold stone of the wall. The silence felt oppressive, suffocating. I should have turned back. But the thought of leaving without understanding what was happening gnawed at me. Was this some sort of trick? A prank, perhaps? But who would do something like this in the middle of nowhere? The more I thought about it, the more the unease crept under my skin. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't a natural phenomenon. Something was wrong, something deeply wrong. I took a step back, my eyes never leaving the wall. The stone surface seemed to shimmer in the fading light of the day, but it was more than just a visual illusion. It felt like the very air around it had been warped. It didn't look right. It was too perfect, too still. It should have been covered in dust, worn down by time, but it wasn't. It was new. Too new. I turned to the side, trying to find something, anything, that could explain it. But then I saw it. In the corner of my vision, a figure standing at the edge of the road, just beyond the wall. I jerked my head around, but there was no one there. What the hell? My pulse quickened, my chest tightening. I had seen something. I knew I had. It was a shadow, a vague shape, but it had been there. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and a chill ran down my spine. I took a few tentative steps backward, my eyes darting nervously to the spot where I had seen the figure. There was nothing. Nothing but empty space and the stretching desert. It's just your mind playing tricks on you, I told myself, trying to rationalize. There's no one here. You're just tired. Maybe the sun's getting to you. But the thought didn't comfort me. I felt exposed, vulnerable. Like something was watching me, waiting for me to make a move. The sense of isolation was suffocating. I took another step back, my eyes still glued to the wall. I wanted to get in my car and drive away, but my feet were heavy. It was as if the air around me had thickened, holding me in place. The road, the car, the world beyond all felt distant, unreachable. Another sound. This time, it was a low hum, almost imperceptible at first, but it grew louder, coming from the direction of the wall. It wasn't a car or an animal, it was something else, something unnatural. A low, vibrating frequency that seemed to crawl inside my bones, making my muscles twitch and my skin crawl. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to shake it off, but the sound only intensified. I opened my eyes again, but this time, the wall was different. It wasn't just a wall anymore, it had become a presence. The way it loomed in front of me felt oppressive, as if it were closing in, pressing against me. The air had become thick, suffocating, and the hum from the wall filled my ears. Was it always this close? I could barely breathe. The world around me seemed to be shifting, bending in ways it shouldn't. The light was wrong, the shadows warped in strange angles. And there, at the base of the wall, a shadow flickered, but there was no shadow. The space where it should have been cast was empty, as if the wall existed in a different dimension entirely. I felt something stir inside me. A gut-wrenching unease that I couldn't explain, a sense that I was losing control of my own perception. This wasn't just a trick of the light. This wasn't a mirage. This was real. I turned to leave, my feet finally obeying my frantic thoughts, but the moment I tried to move, I felt it. The wall seemed to reach out, pulling at me, locking me in place. It wasn't physical, but the pressure was there, heavy and unrelenting. My body refused to obey. I could feel my heart racing, my thoughts spiraling. The humming stopped. And then, silence. A single step backward. I was no longer standing on solid ground, but in something else. A shift, a bend in reality, and before I could comprehend it fully, I was no longer alone. There, standing directly in front of me, was a person. But it wasn't just anyone. It was me. Or at least, it looked like me. The figure had the same clothes, the same expression, even the same face, but it was wrong. There was something hollow in its eyes, something cold and empty in its gaze. It didn't move, didn't speak. Just stood there, watching. I stumbled back, horrified. My breath caught in my throat, and I had to fight the urge to scream. The figure mirrored my every movement. If I took a step, it did too. If I raised my hand, it followed. It was me. But it wasn't. My mind couldn't make sense of it. How could it be? Was this a hallucination? A trick of the mind? But no. This wasn't a trick. The air around me had thickened, and the figure stood there, motionless, staring into my soul. I needed to leave. But the path back to my car felt endless, distant, as though it had been swallowed by the desert. I was trapped. I stood there, my breath caught in my throat, my heart pounding so violently I thought it might break free from my chest. The figure, my double, didn't move. But the weight of its presence pressed down on me, as if it were pulling the very air from my lungs. I could feel it. The coldness in its gaze was so piercing that it seemed to stab into my very being. What is this? I asked myself over and over, but the question only made the fear grow. I tried to step back, but my legs felt heavy, as if they were sinking into the ground. I couldn't take my eyes off the figure. It mirrored my every move, every breath, every twitch of muscle. I knew I had to get away, but I was paralyzed, my body unwilling to cooperate. Focus, focus. I tried to force myself to think clearly. It's just a trick. This isn't real. There's a logical explanation. There's always a logical explanation. But nothing about this felt logical. The figure in front of me wasn't just a reflection of myself, it felt like something more. Something wrong. My mind raced through every possible explanation I could think of. Was it a hallucination? A manifestation of my own fears? But no, it was too real. Too solid. The heat of the desert sun pressed down on us both, but the figure's shadow was absent. It wasn't standing in the same world as I was. I reached out. Slowly, cautiously, my hand trembling as I stretched it toward the figure. My fingers were mere inches from its skin, and I could feel the strange pull between us. It was like a magnetic force, drawing me in. I froze, staring into the dark hollows of its eyes. The emptiness. The void. It felt as if it was sucking the life from me. I need to move. I need to run. But my legs refused to budge. The world around me blurred, as if I were caught between two realities. I was no longer entirely sure what was real and what wasn't. Was I even here? Was this place even real? And then, the figure spoke. Its voice was mine, but not mine. It was hollow and distant, like an echo bouncing off the walls of my mind. You don't belong here. You never did. The words cut through the stillness, each syllable a knife that twisted deeper into my consciousness. I wanted to scream, to shout at it, to demand an explanation, but my throat was dry. Nothing came out. The world felt off. The desert sun, the sand beneath my feet, the dry air, all of it seemed muted, like it was happening somewhere else. Somewhere just out of reach. My eyes darted around, searching for something, anything, that could break the spell. The wall. The wall without shadows. The wall was still there, just behind the figure, towering over us both. I backed away a step, my gaze never leaving my doppelganger. It didn't move. It didn't even blink. But I could feel the tension growing, thickening in the air around me. I knew I had to get away from it, but I couldn't seem to move fast enough. Then, I saw it again. The same figure, standing at the corner of my vision. Another shadow without a shadow. It was behind the wall now, but I could feel it. I knew it was there. I spun around to face it, but the figure was gone. The road was empty again. Just the wall, standing silently in the distance, a silent sentinel to whatever strange force had taken hold of this place. Was I losing my mind? The question repeated in my head, louder now, as if the very thought of it was tearing at the edges of my sanity. I stumbled forward, finally managing to break free from the invisible force that had held me in place. My feet carried me, but I wasn't sure where I was going. Just away. I had to get away from that thing. From the wall. From the feeling of it all. I turned back once more, expecting to see my double following me. But it wasn't there. There was nothing. Only the vast, empty expanse of the desert stretching endlessly before me. My car. I could make it to my car. I forced myself to keep walking, my legs shaky beneath me. My mind raced with questions. I needed to make sense of this. I needed an explanation. But nothing made sense anymore. Nothing at all. I reached my car. My hand shook as I fumbled at the door, my heart still racing in my chest. I slammed it shut behind me, locking the doors, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. What happened? What is happening? I started the engine, my hands gripping the wood tightly as I pulled away from the wall. The world outside seemed normal. The sun was setting on the horizon, casting long shadows across the desert. But as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something deeply wrong. The hum of the engine was the only sound in the car, but in the distance, I thought I saw something moving. A shape. A shadow that didn't belong. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, but when I looked again, there was nothing. I pushed the gas pedal harder, desperate to get away from the wall, from the empty road, from the feeling that something was following me. But even as I drove, I knew that I would never escape. The world had shifted. It had broken, and I was stuck in it. I stood there, my breath caught in my throat, my heart pounding so violently I thought it might break free from my chest. The figure, my double, didn't move, but the weight of its presence pressed down on me as if it were pulling the very air from my lungs. I could feel it. The coldness in its gaze was so piercing that it seemed to stab into my very being. What is this? I asked myself over and over, but the question only made the fear grow. I tried to step back, but my legs felt heavy, as if they were sinking into the ground. I couldn't take my eyes off the figure. It mirrored my every move, every breath, every twitch of muscle. I knew I had to get away, but I was paralyzed, my body unwilling to cooperate. Focus, focus. I tried to force myself to think clearly. It's just a trick. This isn't real. There's a logical explanation. There's always a logical explanation. But nothing about this felt logical. The figure in front of me wasn't just a reflection of myself, it felt like something more. Something wrong. My mind raced through every possible explanation I could think of. Was it a hallucination? A manifestation of my own fears? But no, it was too real. Too solid. The heat of the desert sun pressed down on us both, but the figure's shadow was absent. It wasn't standing in the same world as I was. I reached out. Slowly, cautiously, my hand trembling as I stretched it toward the figure. My fingers were mere inches from its skin, and I could feel the strange pull between us. It was like a magnetic force, drawing me in. I froze, staring into the dark hollows of its eyes. The emptiness. The void. It felt as if it was sucking the life from me. I need to move. I need to run. But my legs refused to budge. The world around me blurred, as if I were caught between two realities. I was no longer entirely sure what was real and what wasn't. Was I even here? Was this place even real? And then, the figure spoke. Its voice was mine, but not mine. It was hollow and distant, like an echo bouncing off the walls of my mind. You don't belong here. You never did. The words cut through the stillness, each syllable a knife that twisted deeper into my consciousness. I wanted to scream, to shout at it, to demand an explanation, but my throat was dry. Nothing came out. The world felt off. The desert sun, the sand beneath my feet, the dry air, all of it seemed muted, like it was happening somewhere else. Somewhere just out of reach. My eyes darted around, searching for something, anything that could break the spell. The wall. The wall without shadows. The wall was still there, just behind the figure, towering over us both. I backed away a step, my gaze never leaving my doppelganger. It didn't move. It didn't even blink. But I could feel the tension growing, thickening in the air around me. I knew I had to get away from it, but I couldn't seem to move fast enough. Then, I saw it again. The same figure, standing at the corner of my vision. Another shadow without a shadow. It was behind the wall now, but I could feel it. I knew it was there. I spun around to face it, but the figure was gone. The road was empty again. Just the wall, standing silently in the distance, a silent sentinel to whatever strange force had taken hold of this place. Was I losing my mind? The question repeated in my head, louder now, as if the very thought of it was tearing at the edges of my sanity. I stumbled forward, finally managing to break free from the invisible force that had held me in place. My feet carried me, but I wasn't sure where I was going. Just away. I had to get away from that thing. From the wall. From the feeling of it all. I turned back once more, expecting to see my double following me. But it wasn't there. There was nothing. Only the vast, empty expanse of the desert stretching endlessly before me. My car. I could make it to my car. I forced myself to keep walking, my legs shaky beneath me. My mind raced with questions. I needed to make sense of this. I needed an explanation. But nothing made sense anymore. Nothing at all. I reached my car. My hand shook as I fumbled with the door, my heart still racing in my chest. I slammed it shut behind me, locking the doors, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. What happened? What is happening? I started the engine, my hands gripping the wood tightly as I pulled away from the wall. The world outside seemed normal. The sun was setting on the horizon, casting long shadows across the desert. But as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something deeply wrong. The hum of the engine was the only sound in the car, but in the distance, I thought I saw something moving. A shape. A shadow that didn't belong. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, but when I looked again, there was nothing. I pushed the gas pedal harder, desperate to get away from the wall, from the empty road, from the feeling that something was following me. But even as I drove, I knew that I would never escape. The world had shifted. It had broken, and I was stuck in it. I couldn't escape it. The road stretched endlessly before me, and yet every turn I made felt like I was only circling back to the same place. The sun was lower now, casting an orange glow over the desert, but the shadows, those shadows, were wrong. They stretched too far, twisted in ways that defied nature. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, the world behind me seemed wrong. Like it wasn't really there. Or maybe it was there, but it wasn't real. The desert was alive with its silence, and it was too loud. Too oppressive. I tried to convince myself that it was just the stress. The heat. The isolation. Maybe I had simply driven too long, too far. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize, the unease in my chest grew stronger, gnawing at me. And then I saw it again. The wall. It stood there, at the edge of my vision, just beyond the horizon. It was a mirage, surely. It had to be. There was no way I was still near it, but the longer I looked, the more I could swear it was there. And it didn't just stand there like a normal wall. It shimmered, undulating in the heat, as if it were a barrier between two worlds. Why is it still there? I asked myself, gripping the steering wheel harder, my knuckles turning white. I glanced around, trying to focus on the road, on the now distant buildings on the horizon. But it was no use. Every time I looked away from the mirror, I could feel the wall pressing in on me, closer and closer. And with it, the soundless pressure of something, a force I couldn't understand but could feel with every fiber of my being. A shadow that followed me. I wasn't even sure how long I'd been driving anymore. The road was endless, just like the feeling that something was wrong, that I wasn't alone, that I couldn't escape. Suddenly, a flash of movement. A figure standing at the side of the road. My breath caught in my throat. It was a person. But when I looked again, it wasn't there. Just a mirage. A trick of the light. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the asphalt. My heart was in my throat, my breath shallow and fast. The car came to a stop, the engine idling loudly in the heavy silence of the desert. Sweat was pouring down my face, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. I looked into the rearview mirror. There was nothing. Nothing but the endless stretch of road and the darkening sky. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that I never had been. I opened the car door. The heat of the desert night hit me, but it didn't feel like the dry warmth of a summer evening. It felt like a suffocating weight pressing down on me. I took a hesitant step outside, my boots crunching against the gravel. The air was still. Too still. Then I heard it. A whisper. Faint, like a soft breath against my ear, and yet it came from all around me. My name. You're not meant to be here. I froze, my blood running cold. The voice wasn't human. It wasn't even familiar. But it was unmistakably clear. I spun around, but there was nothing. Just the vast, empty desert stretching out before me. I could see the outline of the wall now, shimmering at the edges of my vision. It was closer. And the shape behind it, the figure, was more distinct now. I felt my stomach lurch, the air around me thick with the feeling of impending doom. I stepped back into the car, slamming the door behind me. I didn't want to look back. I didn't want to acknowledge what was there. But the sound of someone, scraping against the outside of the car made my skin crawl. The lights flickered. The dashboard shimmered, like it wasn't solid. The whole world felt unreal, like I was slipping between dimensions. This isn't real, I thought. This can't be real. But the pull, the weight of it, was unbearable. I started the car, my hands shaking violently as I pressed the pedal. The engine roared to life, but it didn't feel like it was moving the way it should. It felt sluggish, like the road was pulling back, unwilling to let me go. I looked up, and there it was again. The wall. This time, it was directly in front of me, rising up like a monolith, stretching impossibly high into the sky. I slammed on the brakes, but the car didn't stop. It kept moving, pushing me forward toward the wall. I could hear my own breathing now, ragged and desperate. My hands gripped the steering wheel, my body rigid with fear. There was no way to turn back. No way to escape. The wall loomed closer, filling my vision, blocking out everything else. I slammed my eyes shut, bracing for impact. But the crash never came. Instead, there was nothing. I opened my eyes, and the car was still moving. But the world was different. I was no longer on the road. The desert had vanished. The wall was gone. I wasn't in the car anymore. I stood in a room. A small, dimly lit room. And in front of me stood a mirror. A mirror that reflected nothing but an empty void. Where am I? The question echoed in my mind, but I couldn't answer it. I felt a cold, choking terror wash over me as the void seemed to grow larger, pulling me in. I reached out toward the mirror. My hand touched the cold glass, and for a moment, everything went still. And then, I saw it. A shadow. A figure standing behind me. My own reflection, but wrong. Twisted. The face grinned, but the smile didn't reach its eyes. I tried to pull away, but my hand wouldn't move. The glass seemed to be pulling me in, as if it were alive. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness, the void closing in. And then, nothing. I woke up. But I didn't know if I really did. The world around me was cold, hollow. I couldn't feel the air, couldn't hear the sound of my breath. There was only silence. That thick, suffocating silence that seemed to stretch endlessly. I couldn't remember how long I'd been in this place, or what this place even was. The room I stood in had no walls, no ceiling, just an endless blackness that stretched beyond what my eyes could see. There were no sounds, no wind, no feeling of being alive. It was as if I was trapped in a place that didn't exist. The mirror in front of me was the only thing that seemed real. It was solid, cold to the touch, but it reflected nothing. Not me. Not anything at all. I reached out again, my fingers trembling as I traced the surface of the glass. The emptiness reflected back at me, like a void that had consumed everything. The chill ran through me, but I couldn't look away. It felt like I was falling into it, my body drawn toward the reflection, but there was nothing to fall into. Only darkness. And then it came again. The figure. The one that wasn't me. The reflection in the mirror grinned, its smile stretching wider than it should. But there was no warmth in its expression. No human emotion. Its eyes were empty. Hollow. It was like a shadow cast over the void. It was me, but it wasn't. I could feel it watching me, studying me, as if it had been waiting for something. It's not real, I told myself, but my voice was drowned by the silence. My heart beat faster, a drum in my chest. I stepped back, but my body wouldn't move as I wanted. It was as if the mirror had locked me in place. The figure in the reflection stepped forward, mimicking my every movement. Its eyes fixed on me. There was no sense of safety, no familiar feeling of being in control. It was wrong. And it was getting closer. The air shifted. A cold breeze brushed against my skin, but it was strange. It wasn't natural. It didn't belong here. It was as if the very air was alive, pressing in on me. I could feel the walls of this place closing in, but there were no walls. Just that mirror and the ever closer reflection. My pulse quickened. I need to wake up. But it felt like I was already awake. Maybe I had never truly been asleep. Maybe I had never truly been anywhere. Maybe none of it was real. The figure's grin grew wider. No, I thought desperately. No more. I turned and ran. I didn't know where I was running, but I ran, my feet moving faster than my mind could comprehend. But the mirror remained, always in my path. And no matter how far I ran, I couldn't escape it. I stopped, gasping for air that wasn't there, and I turned to face it. The mirror seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, like a heartbeat that wasn't mine. The figure's eyes locked with mine. This time, I saw something in them. A knowledge. A certainty that I didn't understand. It wasn't me looking back at me, it was something that knew everything about me. The reflection was alive. It was not just a shadow, a trick of the light. It was a thing that had learned everything about me. It stepped out of the mirror, crossing the threshold between this place and the world beyond. My mind screamed in panic, but there was no sound. No escape. The figure's hand reached out. And it wasn't just a reflection anymore. I backed away, but my body was frozen, stuck in place. My legs wouldn't move. The figure smiled. No, it grinned as it grew closer. I could feel its cold touch on my skin as it placed its hand on my shoulder. It was like ice. It was real. It was touching me. The last thought that crossed my mind was that there had never been a wall. There had never been a mirror. Only the thing behind me, closing in. The reflection didn't let go. And I didn't know if I ever had a chance to. The void consumed me, and with it, the world I had known. The last thing I saw was my own face, smiling back at me, empty. Lifeless. Like the shadow it had become. And then, the darkness. The silence. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.